He grabbed her wrist so hard she gasped. Grant Halston, billionaire titan, the man who had spent 8 years telling Lydia she owed him everything, stood in his own living room with another woman's perfume on his collar and his wife's anniversary necklace around a stranger's neck, and he squeezed tighter. "You embarrass me in my house again," he said, his voice dropping to something cold and unrecognizable, "and you will regret it." Lydia looked down at his hand, then up at his face, and in that single moment, something inside her, something he had been slowly killing for 8 years, went completely permanently quiet. She had her answer now. If this story already has you feeling something, please take a second right now to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below and tell us what city you are watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let us begin. The rain had been falling over Seattle for 3 straight days. Not the dramatic kind of rain that announces itself with thunder and lightning and all the theater that storms usually bring. This was the quiet Pacific Northwest kind, steady, relentless, the kind that soaks through your coat before you realize it has started. The kind that makes you feel like the sky itself has simply given up trying to be anything other than gray. Lydia Marlowe had left her office downtown a full 2 hours earlier than she had planned, and later, when she thought back on that evening, she would wonder whether something in her had already known, whether some deep, wordless part of her had been building toward this night for a long time, waiting for the moment when all the small, quiet aches she had been filing away inside herself finally demanded to be named out loud. She did not take a cab. She drove herself, the windshield wipers cutting back and forth in their steady rhythm, the city lights blurring through the rain-streaked glass into something almost beautiful. She listened to the radio for a few minutes and then turned it off because even music felt like too much. She drove in silence. She was good at silence. She had become very, very good at it over 8 years of marriage to a man who believed that the loudest voice in any room was the most important one. The house was lit from the inside. She noticed that before she even pulled into the driveway. The main living room windows were glowing warm and amber against the darkened sky, and even from outside she could see movement through the glass. She could not hear it yet, but she could see the shapes of people moving, and she could see the flickering blue light of the gas fireplace that Grant only turned on when he wanted to impress someone. She had been with Grant Halston for 9 years, one of dating 8 of marriage, and she had long ago learned to read the small signals of his world. The fireplace meant performance. The fireplace meant there was an audience and he was playing to it. She let herself in through the front door quietly. Later she would not be able to explain why she did not announce herself. It was her home. She had every right to walk through that door the same way she had walked through it 10,000 times before. But something made her quiet. Something made her still, and she stood in the entry hall for just a moment listening. She heard laughter. His laughter she recognized immediately, that particular low, effortless sound he made when he was performing warmth for someone he wanted to impress. But the other laugh-lighter musical, A Little Breathless, was a woman's voice, a voice Lydia did not recognize. She walked to the entrance of the living room. Grant was sitting on the long, cream-colored sofa, his jacket off his sleeves rolled to the elbows, the way he only did when he felt completely at ease. Beside him, close, in a way that required an explanation, sat a woman Lydia had never seen inside this house before. She was young, maybe early 30s, with dark hair that fell past her shoulders, and the kind of polished effortlessness that announced itself as expensive before it announced itself as anything else. The woman was laughing at something Grant had said. Her head was tilted slightly toward him. Her hand rested on the sofa cushion between them, close enough to his that the suggestion was already there without the contact. And around her neck, and this was the thing that stopped Lydia's breath mid-chest, around her neck was a necklace. Not just any necklace. A delicate gold chain with a single oval locket, small and understated and impossibly specific, because Lydia had looked at that locket every day for 5 years. Because Grant had placed it around her own neck on their 5th wedding anniversary in a restaurant in downtown Seattle, and said with the kind of gravity he usually reserved for business announcements that this would always belong to her. That it was not just jewelry, that it was a promise, and now it was around another woman's neck. Lydia did not scream. She did not drop the keys she was holding or press her hand to her mouth or do any of the things that the body wants to do when something inside it breaks. She stood in the entrance of her living room and she breathed. She breathed the way her mother had taught her to breathe through hard things, slowly all the way down, like the air had somewhere important to go. Then she said quietly, and without any particular drama, "Why is she wearing something you promised would always belong to me?" The effect in the room was immediate. Grant turned so fast he nearly knocked his glass off the side table. The woman Serena Lydia would later learn her name was Serena Vale, pulled back and sat up straight in the same motion as if a current had run through her. The easy warmth of the room dissolved in an instant, replaced by something cold and electric and deeply, deeply uncomfortable. Grant recovered faster than most people would have. That was one of the things about him. He was extraordinary at recovery. 15 years of high-stakes business negotiations had given him a particular ability to reassemble his expression and his posture and his voice into something controlled in the space of a single breath. "Lydia," he said, "you're home early." "I am," she agreed. She was still looking at the necklace. "Who is she?" "This is Serena Vale. She's a consultant. We were discussing a project." He said it easily, the way he said most things, with the complete confidence of a man who had never seriously expected to be questioned. "There was nothing to call you about." "I'm not asking why you didn't call me," Lydia said. "I'm asking why she's wearing my necklace." The word "my" landed in the room with more weight than Lydia's quiet voice would have suggested. Serena touched the locket instinctively, her fingers curling around it, and then seemed to think better of the gesture and let her hand fall. Grant exhaled through his nose. It was a sound Lydia knew. It was the sound he made when he had decided that whatever was happening was beneath him. "It's jewelry, Lydia. I didn't think you'd even notice it was gone." The sentence was extraordinary in its smallness. Not an explanation, not an apology, not even the pretense of either, just the quiet, enormous assumption that she would not have noticed, that the loss of something he had promised her would slip past her, the way he imagined most things slipped past her, undetected, unimportant, managed by his superior awareness of what actually mattered. Lydia looked at Serena for a long moment. Serena had the grace to look uncomfortable. She was gathering her bag from the floor beside the sofa, which was the correct instinct, and she was not meeting Lydia's eyes, which was also the correct instinct, and Lydia found that she could not summon hatred for this woman, not yet, not tonight. What she felt was something much quieter and much more devastating than hatred. She felt tired. She felt the accumulated weight of 8 years of being dismissed, arriving all at once in her chest. "I'd like her to leave," Lydia said. She said it directly to Grant, not to Serena, because this was a conversation between the two of them, whether Grant understood that yet or not. And that was when he made the mistake that would define the rest of the evening. Grant stood up and he straightened his cuffs the way he always did when he was preparing to be formidable, and he said, "I don't think you have any reason to embarrass anyone in my house." My house. Those 2 words. Lydia had heard similar words before in various forms across various arguments. My money, my career, my decisions, the possessive that attached itself to everything around her, everything except her. She had never been my wife in the warm, claiming way that word was supposed to work. She had always been something less specific than that, an accessory, an assumption, a woman whose presence he had decided upon and whose continued presence he had stopped noticing. But my house was particularly clarifying, because she had lived in this house for 6 years. She had chosen the furniture and negotiated with the contractors and solved every small crisis the building threw at them and made it livable in the 10,000 invisible ways that make a place feel like a home rather than just an expensive structure near the water. She had made it his house by making it a home, and in return, he had decided it was his house, and she was a guest in it. She looked at him steadily. "I'm not embarrassing anyone," she said. "I'm asking your colleague to leave so that we can speak privately." "There's nothing to discuss privately," Grant said, and his voice had an edge now. Not anger exactly, impatience. The impatience of a man who had already decided the outcome of this conversation and was simply waiting for everyone else to arrive at the same conclusion. "Serena is leaving because it's late, not because you've decided to make a scene." "I haven't raised my voice once," Lydia said. Serena had moved toward the hallway. She stopped at the edge of the room as if waiting for permission to leave, which Lydia found both absurd and oddly sympathetic. "You don't need to raise your voice to make a scene," Grant said. "Standing there looking at me like that is a scene." Serena took that moment to murmur something about getting her coat and disappeared into the hallway, which was a relief for everyone. The room felt different without her. Smaller, more specific. Grant stood on one side of it and Lydia stood on the other, and 8 years of marriage stretched between them like a surface that had always looked solid from above, but they could now both feel water all the way down. Grant spoke first. Of course he did. "I know what you're thinking," he said, and his voice shifted into something that was almost conciliatory, a tone she recognized from arguments, past the tone that meant he had calculated that softness was the more efficient approach. "But you're building something out of nothing. Serena is a business contact. The necklace I thought you never wore it anymore. I didn't think it mattered to you." "You thought it didn't matter to me," Lydia repeated slowly. "You haven't worn it in over a year." "I keep it in my jewelry box," she said, "in the same place I've kept it for 5 years. You went into my jewelry box and took something I kept there and you put it on another woman." He opened his mouth. She kept going because she had something she needed to say, and she was not going to let the rhythm of this conversation be his to control. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to actually think about the answer before you give it to me because I think it matters." She paused. "Do you even know what I wanted before I became your wife?" Grant blinked. It was a small, involuntary thing, barely a flicker, but she caught it because she had spent 8 years watching his face for exactly these moments, the small cracks where the real response lived before the performed one covered it over. "That's a strange question," he said. "It's a simple question. Lydia, do you know what I studied?" she said. "Do you know what my thesis was on? Do you know what firm offered me a position 3 months before we met? Do you know why I turned it down?" She was not raising her voice. She was asking the questions with the same calm she had brought to the door, but each one landed like something dropped from a height. "Do you know one thing, one single thing that I wanted for myself before I became part of your life?" The silence was long enough to be its own answer. Grant looked at her with something that was almost annoyance, because annoyance was easier than the thing underneath it, which was the disorienting recognition that she had asked him something he could not answer. Grant Halston was not accustomed to being unable to answer things. "You were waiting tables when I met you," he said finally, and his voice had recalibrated again back toward the ground of the argument where he felt most secure. "I never said anything wrong about that. I never looked down on you for it." "You looked down on me for nothing else," Lydia said quietly. "That's not fair. You told me last March that I was lucky I didn't have to worry about money. You told me in October that my ideas about investment trends were something I'd read in a magazine somewhere. You told me 2 years ago when I mentioned going back to work that I had everything I needed, and what was I looking for?" She stopped. "Was any of that not true?" Silence again. From the hallway there was the sound of a door, soft and apologetic, Serena leaving. The front door opened and closed. They were alone. Grant spread his hands. It was a gesture she had seen him use in boardrooms, a gesture that meant I am being reasonable, and the room needs to recognize that. "You did have everything you needed. I provided—" "You provided things," Lydia said. "You were very good at providing things. You were not good at providing the belief that I was capable of being more than the woman who received them." Grant's jaw tightened. "This is what you do," he said, and now the edge was back sharper. "You turn everything into an indictment. I give you a beautiful life, and you turn it into evidence of my failures." "I'm not here to indict you," she said. "I'm genuinely trying to understand whether you ever saw me." "Of course I saw you." "Then what did you see?" He did not answer. She waited. The silence between them was the most honest thing that had happened in that house in a very long time. Finally, quietly, she said, "You saw the waitress you rescued. That's what you saw. And you kept seeing her every day for 8 years, even when the woman in front of you was something completely different." She let that sit for a moment. "That's not love, Grant. That's inventory." He flinched. She saw it. He was good at hiding reactions, but she knew this one, the very slight tightening around his eyes, that meant something had arrived somewhere it was not supposed to. "I'm going upstairs," she said. He thought she was going to bed. She could see it in the way he exhaled, the slight easing of his shoulders, the relief of a man who had decided the confrontation was ending on terms he could manage. She went upstairs. She was gone for about 4 minutes. When she came back down, she was carrying a bag. Not a suitcase, nothing dramatic, nothing that required a second trip. A canvas travel bag, medium-sized, the dark blue one she had bought years ago before a work conference she had gone to in Portland before they were married. It was already packed. She had packed it 3 weeks ago. She had not let herself think too carefully about what that meant those nights when she folded things quietly and placed them inside the bag and then slid the bag to the back of the closet shelf. She told herself it was preparation. She told herself she was simply being organized, being careful, being the steady, practical woman her mother had raised her to be. But some part of her had known. Grant stared at the bag. The color left his face in a way she had never seen before. In 9 years with this man, she had watched him face down hostile investors and failed ventures and personal crises and the death of his father, and she had never seen him look the way he looked right now. He looked young. He looked uncertain. He looked for just a moment like someone who had not been told the rules of the game he was suddenly playing. Lydia. His voice was different, lower, something in it that she might have recognized as vulnerability if she had encountered it from him more than once or twice in a decade. "What are you doing?" "I'm leaving," she said simply. "You're—" He stopped, started again. "You're not leaving. You're upset. I understand that, and I'm not performing an emotion at you," she said. "I'm telling you what I'm doing. Put the bag down." "No." He moved toward her. Not aggressively, she registered that even in this moment, because she was always registering things. It was simply what she did. He moved toward her, the way he moved toward problems that needed managing with purpose and the assumption of authority. "We can talk about this. You're overreacting to something that— I want you to let me leave," she said. He stopped. The word want. She had not said please. She had not phrased it as a question. She had stated it as the simple fact it was. He looked at her for a long moment. And then, because he was a man who had spent his entire adult life learning that force was the most reliable tool in any difficult situation, he reached for the version of force he knew best. "Walk out if you want," he said. His voice had gone cold, controlled the voice from the boardroom, the voice that was designed to close rooms around people, to make them feel the specific smallness of opposing him. "Go ahead, but you should understand something before you do." He paused, and the pause was calculated. "You'll discover very quickly what your life looks like without me." Lydia was quiet for a moment. Then he said the thing, the truest and most terrible thing, the sentence that was so revealing precisely because he believed it completely, because it was not cruelty for the sake of cruelty, but cruelty rooted in genuine conviction. "You were nobody before I found you." In the room that followed that sentence, the air itself seemed to stop. Lydia stood with her bag and her coat and her car keys, and she looked at Grant Halston, the man she had chosen, the man she had moved her whole quiet life to accommodate, the man for whom she had made herself smaller in 100 different ways over 8 years, and she understood that this sentence was not an attack. It was a confession. It was the most honest thing he had said to her in years. It was the organizing principle of their entire marriage stated out loud at last, and it was devastating, and it was clarifying, and somewhere beneath the pain of it, there was the strange cold relief of finally knowing the exact shape of the thing you have been living inside. She walked to the front door. She took off her wedding ring. She placed it on the small table beside the door, the one she had chosen at an antique market in Capitol Hill 3 years ago, the one where they usually dropped their keys and their mail and the small accumulated debris of daily life. She turned and looked at him, not with hatred, not with satisfaction, with something quieter and more complete than either of those things. "That's the tragedy, Grant," she said. "You spent 8 years believing I needed you, and you never once wondered why I chose you." She opened the door. The rain was still falling steady and indifferent and clean. She walked out. The door closed behind her. She did not run. She did not cry. Not yet. Not until she was 3 blocks away and parked on a side street and could finally let the shaking come. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel, and she breathed, in and out, all the way down like the air had somewhere important to go, the way her mother had taught her. She sat there for a long time, and then she started the car. Grant stood in the entry hall for several minutes. He was waiting with the patience of a man who had learned through long experience that most problems resolve themselves if you give them enough time for the sound of the car reversing out of the driveway and coming back. It did not come. He walked to the window and looked out. The driveway was empty. The rain fell across the empty space where her car had been. He told himself she would call within an hour. She did not call. He told himself she would be back by morning. Morning came. The house was silent in a way it had never been silent before, and Grant Halston stood in his enormous kitchen and realized for the first time that he did not know where she kept the coffee or how many spoons she used, or even whether she took it with milk or without. He had lived beside this woman for 8 years, and he did not know how she took her coffee. He made himself a cup and sat at the counter. He thought about the bag. He had understood in the moment she came down the stairs with it that it had been packed in advance. He understood this because he was not a stupid man. Brilliance, in fact, was the thing he prized most about himself, the thing he had organized most of his identity around. He understood that a bag packed before the crisis meant the crisis had not caused the leaving. The leaving had been coming. He had simply provided the occasion. He sat with that understanding for a while, and then because it was easier, he filed it away under the category of things she would clarify when she returned. She would return. She had nowhere else to go. He was almost entirely certain of that. He was wrong, but he would not know that yet for another 3 weeks. The first week was the strangest. He had people, staff, assistants, the vast operational infrastructure of his life, and none of them were Lydia. And he began noticing in the first week how much of what he had attributed to that infrastructure had actually been her. Not the cleaning or the cooking or the things that could be purchased. Smaller things. The way someone had always arranged his schedule around the events he cared about without him having to explain which events those were. The way his home had a temperature that was not too warm and not too cold. The way fresh flowers appeared in the kitchen on Tuesdays, which he had never particularly noticed, but whose absence he noticed now. The way his dry cleaning came back perfectly sorted his suits together, and his shirts together, and his casual clothes together, because she knew how he thought about clothes, even though he had never told her. He had never told her because he had never thought to tell her. He had assumed it was done and had not asked how. By the end of the second week, he had received 2 texts from her, both brief, both practical, one about the calendar for an appointment she had made for him months ago, one about a package being delivered, both signed with her initial, both professional to the point of blankness. He responded to both. She did not reply further. By the 3rd week, he began to understand that she was not coming back, and the understanding arrived not as a single revelation, but as a slow accumulation of evidence, each piece small and ordinary, that together built towards something he did not want to look at directly. She had not contacted anyone in his circle. She had not gone to his friends, had not appealed to any of the people around him, had not created the kind of network of concerned mutual acquaintances that a woman in trouble usually generated. No one called him to say they had heard from Lydia. No one called him to say they were worried. She had simply stepped sideways out of the frame and disappeared into a life she apparently had access to that was entirely separate from his. He did not know what that life looked like. He realized, sitting in his office on a Thursday afternoon, watching the rain blur the Seattle skyline into something gray and impressionistic, that he did not know very much about what her life had looked like at any point. He knew the version of her life that existed in relation to him, the charity events she attended at his side, the dinners she organized for his clients, the quiet, gracious presence she maintained in every room she entered, the way she made his world feel more civilized simply by existing in it. He knew those things. He did not know what she had been before. And the specific not knowing of it, the way the question kept arriving in his mind and finding no answer, began to feel like a problem he needed to solve. Not because solving it would bring her back. He was still operating on the assumption, weakening now, but not yet gone, that something would bring her back, some realization on her part, or some conversation he could engineer. But because the not knowing was beginning to feel like something other than ignorance, it was beginning to feel like it had always been there, like he had always not known this, like he had been living for 8 years next to a woman he had never actually looked at. He kept coming back to one moment, not the necklace, not the bag, not the ring beside the door. One particular sentence delivered in her quiet, precise voice in the room after Serena had left. "Do you even know what I wanted before I became your wife?" He had not answered. He told himself he had not answered because the question was unfair, because it was designed to trap him, because no married person knows everything about their spouse's pre-marriage self, and that was not an indictment, it was simply the nature of time passing. But that was not quite the truth. The truth was that he had not answered because the answer had arrived in that moment with terrifying clarity, and the answer was no. Not no as in he had forgotten, no as in he had never asked, No, as in it had genuinely not occurred to him across 9 years of knowing this woman to treat her history as something with content. She had been a waitress in a small Oregon town. She had been capable and gentle and quietly intelligent in a way that had charmed him without challenging him. She had become his wife. He had never asked what else she might have been. The not asking had seemed like a kindness at some earlier point. She came from very little. He had offered her an extraordinary life. What would be gained by dwelling on what came before when what came after was so much better? He had never considered that from where she stood, the before might have looked different than it did from where he stood. He had not considered it because he had not tried. On the morning of day 23, Grant Halston sat in his office and stared at the Seattle skyline and admitted privately to himself something that felt like having the floor shift beneath him. He might not know who his wife was, not the performance version, the actual person. And if that was true, if he had been living beside a stranger for 8 years, then everything he thought he knew about their marriage, everything he had told himself about what she needed and what she wanted and what he had given her, all of it needed to be examined from scratch. I was not a man who enjoyed examining things from scratch. He was a man who preferred the view from altitude, the broad strategic overview, the pattern recognition that moved past individual details toward the bigger picture. This was what had made him extraordinary in business. It was he was beginning to understand with the specific discomfort of a genuinely new thought, possibly what had made him a catastrophic partner. He picked up his phone. He did not call Lydia. He was not ready for that. And more importantly, he had the sudden instinct that calling her was not what this moment required. What this moment required was information. And Grant Halston had always known how to get information. He called a different number. He asked a different question. He began quietly, and with the methodical precision that had made him a billionaire, to try to find out who Lydia Marlowe actually was. He was not prepared for what he found, but that discovery was still 3 weeks away. Right now, in an apartment in the Eastlake neighborhood of Seattle, Lydia Marlowe was making her own cup of coffee exactly the way she liked it, with no one's preferences to accommodate but her own, and looking out a rain-blurred window at the city she had grown up in without Grant's knowledge, and she was opening her laptop, and she was beginning. She had been waiting to begin for a very long time. The rain kept falling. Seattle kept moving. And somewhere in the city, 2 people who had shared a life for 8 years were finally separately becoming fully themselves. One of them had known it was possible all along. The other one was just beginning to understand that he had no idea what had been standing beside him. 3 days passed. Grant told himself she needed space. He was good at that reframing, taking whatever uncomfortable reality was in front of him and sliding it into a category that made him the reasonable one. She was emotional. She was processing. She would call when she was ready, and when she called, he would be generous about it, because generosity was something he was very good at when it cost him nothing. I went to work. He took his meetings. He gave his presentations with the same commanding ease he always brought to a room, because the room did not know anything had happened, and Grant Halston had never once allowed the room to know more than he wanted it to. But at night in the house that was too quiet in a way he kept almost being able to name, he waited. She did not call. On the 4th day, he texted her. Something brief, calibrated to sound casual, just checking in. The message was read within minutes. No response came. On the 6th day, he tried again. A different approach, softer, almost apologetic, the kind of message designed to open a door without appearing to open a door. Still nothing. On the 8th day, her attorney contacted his. Grant sat with that information for a long time. An attorney. She had already retained an attorney, which meant she had retained an attorney before she walked out the door, which meant the bag had not been the only thing she had prepared in advance. He kept arriving at this thought, and then moving away from it because the full shape of what it implied was something he was not ready to sit with directly. He called his own attorney. He was told to be patient. He was told these things often resolve themselves. He said he understood and hung up and understood nothing. Week 2 brought something new, the specific, embarrassing discovery of how little he knew about the mechanics of his own life. It started small. He needed the name of their insurance broker because something had arrived in the mail that required a response. He could not find it. He looked through every folder he could locate and called his assistant, who did not have it, and eventually found it on a card tucked inside a kitchen drawer, in a drawer that was organized in a way that made sense once he saw it, but that he never would have found on his own. The card was in Lydia's handwriting. He stood at that kitchen drawer for longer than he would admit. Then there was the matter of the dry cleaning. He had simply assumed it happened. He had been assuming it happened for 8 years. When he called to ask which service they used, his assistant did not know, because apparently Lydia had handled it personally rather than delegating it, which meant she had been doing it herself regularly for years, without it ever once registering as something that was being done. He found the number on her old phone, which she had left behind, not her personal phone, an older one she had kept in a kitchen drawer alongside chargers and extra keys and the other small administrative objects of household life. He charged it and turned it on and stood there feeling like he was doing something wrong, which irritated him because it was his house and his life, and there was nothing wrong about it. The phone had contacts he did not recognize, not dozens, not some secret parallel life, but a handful of names attached to email addresses and phone numbers that meant nothing to him. A professor at the University of Washington. Someone identified only as J. Mercer. A woman named Naomi with a note beside her name that said, "Software Brilliant Keep." He did not know what any of them meant. He put the phone down. He went back to work. By the end of week 2, he had started sleeping badly, which was not something that happened to him. Grant Halston was a man who slept with the particular efficiency of someone who has decided that even unconsciousness should be productive. He fell asleep quickly and woke up rested and did not lie in the dark, having feelings about things. That was simply who he was. Except now he was lying in the dark. Not dramatically, not with his hands pressed to his chest processing something cinematic, just awake, staring at the ceiling, running through conversations the way you run through spreadsheets looking for the number that explains why the column doesn't balance. He kept coming back to her question, the one she had asked him the night she left standing in the living room with her voice absolutely level and her eyes absolutely clear. "Do you even know what I wanted before I became your wife?" He had not answered it because he had not had an answer. He still did not have an answer, and the absence of the answer had begun to feel less like an oversight and more like a symptom of something he did not have a name for yet. On day 19, he did something he had not done in years. He called his older sister Patricia, who lived in Portland, and who had always possessed the particular quality of telling him things he did not want to hear in a way that made him listen anyway. "She left," he said when Patricia picked up. A pause. "I heard." "From who?" "From the fact that you're calling me at 9 on a Tuesday night, Grant. You never call anyone unless something's wrong." Another pause. "What happened?" he told her. Not everything, not the necklace, not the full shape of it, but enough. He told her about the bag, about the attorney, about the silence that had been going on for almost 3 weeks. Patricia listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "That's why I called. What did Lydia do before you met her?" Grant blinked. "She was a waitress in a small town in Oregon. I've told you this." "I know what you told me," Patricia said. "I'm asking what she did, what she was working toward, what she had before the restaurant." "I don't—" He stopped, started again. "She was from a working-class family. Her mother was sick. She was getting by." "Did you ever ask her?" The question sat between them like something dropped on a table. "Patricia, did you ever ask her?" Grant, not assume, ask. He did not answer, which was its own answer, and Patricia heard it. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay. I think you need to find out." "Find out what?" "Who she was before you decided who she was." I wanted to dismiss that. It was the kind of sentence that sounded profound in a way that irritated him, the kind of thing people said when they wanted to seem insightful, without having to do the work of being specific. But he could not dismiss it, because it landed somewhere it was apparently waiting to land somewhere beneath the floor of the argument he had been having with himself for 3 weeks. He hung up without a good answer, and sat in his enormous quiet house and thought about it. The next morning he made a call. The man he called was named Daniel Cho. Grant had used him twice before for due diligence on potential business partners, quiet, methodical, thorough, the kind of professional who understood that what he found was confidential and what he reported was accurate, and what existed between those two things was none of his business. Grant had been comfortable using him for business. He told himself this was business. He told himself he was simply trying to understand a situation that required information he did not have. He told himself a lot of things in those weeks. He said, "Her name is Lydia Marlowe. She's my wife. I need to know her background. Education, professional history, everything before we met, and anything current." Daniel Cho said he understood. He said he would be in touch. Grant went to work. He did not hear back for 11 days. Those 11 days were the longest of the entire separation, not because of what Grant did during them, but because of what Lydia was doing in an apartment in Eastlake, in a life he knew nothing about, while he waited for someone else to tell him who his wife was. Lydia had slept well on her first night in the apartment. This surprised her, and then it didn't. She lay in the bed she had bought from a furniture store on a Tuesday afternoon, a real bed, not an air mattress because she was 34 years old, and she had promised herself she would not perform struggle for anyone's benefit, including her own, and she stared at the ceiling of a room that was entirely hers and felt something she hadn't expected. She felt light, not happy exactly. The grief was still there, not grief for Grant, not exactly, but grief for the years, for the version of herself she had folded up and stored away, for the particular loneliness of being someone's wife, in a way that required you to be nobody else. That grief was real, and she did not pretend it wasn't. But underneath it was something that felt like clean air, like a window opened in a room that had been closed too long. She made coffee. She drank it the way she liked it. She opened her laptop. She called Julian Mercer. Julian picked up on the second ring, which told her he had been expecting her call. He always picked up quickly when he expected her. He had learned over the years of their intermittent professional correspondence that she did not call without a reason. "Lydia," he said. Just her name. No performance, no setup, no "how are you," because they were past that. "I'm ready," she said. A pause, brief and specific. "How ready?" "I left Grant. I have my mother's portfolio. I have the platform design. I have 3 years of research you've already read most of." She paused. "I'm ready." Julian Mercer was 46 years old, a former economics professor who had migrated into venture capital with the particular combination of intellectual rigor and instinctive risk tolerance that made him genuinely good at it rather than just successful at it. He had met Lydia at a conference 7 years ago, before she had fully disappeared into Grant Halston's orbit. They had argued about predictive debt modeling for 40 minutes at a cocktail party, and he had gone home and looked up her thesis and called her the next day to tell her it was one of the clearest pieces of applied financial thinking he had read in years. She had thanked him and then gradually returned to her life as Grant Halston's wife, but she had never stopped sending Julian papers, quietly, sporadically, the way you leave messages for someone you trust to hold things for you. An analysis here, a revised model there, a note saying, "I've been thinking about the community bank angle, tell me if this is wrong." He had told her when she was wrong. More often he had told her when she was right. He knew the platform. He had been watching it develop for 3 years, in the stolen hours she apparently had more of than her husband realized. "Okay," Julian said, "let's meet." They met 2 days later at a coffee shop near the University District, far enough from downtown that the chance of running into anyone from Grant's world was minimal. Lydia arrived 5 minutes early. Julian arrived 4 minutes early. They shook hands across the small table in the specific way of people who respect each other enough that the greeting doesn't require warmth to perform. She pulled out her laptop. He pulled out his. She had updated the proposal since the last version he'd seen. Not significantly, the core of it had been solid for over a year, but she had refined the financial projections, tightened the market positioning, added a section on regulatory compliance that she knew would be the first thing a serious investor would ask about. Julian read it the way he read everything, quickly and completely, his expression giving almost nothing away. She drank her coffee. She did not fill the silence. She had always been good at not filling silence, which was one of the things Julian had noticed about her. Early on, she was one of the very few people he had met who treated silence as neutral space rather than a problem to solve. He closed the laptop. He looked at her. "How long have you been sitting on this?" "Long enough," she said. "Lydia. 3 years for the full model. The core concept goes back further." He nodded slowly. "The community bank angle is new." "It's been there. I just built it out." "It's the strongest part," he said. "That's the entry point nobody else is using. The big fintech companies are looking at institutional partners. You're going direct to the people who actually need it." "That's the point," she said. "I know it's the point." He leaned back. "I want to be involved." She looked at him. "Define involved." "I want to lead the first round. Whatever you need to get the thing built. I have 2 other investors I can bring who understand what we're looking at." He paused. "But I want to be clear about something." "Go ahead." This needs to be your company, Lydia, not mine, not anyone else's. I'll take my stake and I'll do my job, but the founding vision is yours, and I won't let anyone compromise it, including me. He met her eyes. I've watched this thing grow inside a marriage that didn't deserve to contain it. I want to see what it looks like when it has room. She was quiet for a moment. Okay, she said. Okay. Yes, let's do it. He smiled. It was a small smile, but genuine. Do you have a name? Marlowe Systems, she said. Risk intelligence for the people the big platforms ignore. I like it. She called Naomi Pierce that afternoon. Naomi was 29, a software engineer who had been following Lydia's published work. What little of it had made it into public forums under her name, since her undergraduate thesis had cited one of Lydia's early papers. They had connected online 3 years ago initially through a technical forum about predictive financial modeling. Naomi had messaged her with a correction to a secondary calculation in one of her posts, and the correction had been right, which meant Lydia had responded, which had led to a conversation that had been running in the background ever since. Naomi picked up immediately. Is it happening? How did you know? Because you're calling from a number I don't recognize, and your voice sounds like you've slept for the first time in a year. A pause. I'm in. I've been ready for 8 months. Tell me what you need. What Lydia needed was a prototype, a real one, not a theoretical framework, not a research model, but a working piece of software that could demonstrate the platform's core function, identifying dangerous debt patterns in small business and household financial data before they became crises. The kind of thing that a community banker could look at and immediately understand. The kind of thing that could save a family's savings before the moment of disaster rather than processing it after. Naomi had been quietly building pieces of it in her spare time. She had not mentioned this. She brought it to their first meeting in Lydia's apartment, spread across her laptop, and watched Lydia's face when she saw it. You built this without... I believed the platform was real, Naomi said simply. I wanted to be ready when you were. Lydia looked at her for a moment. You're hired. I know, Naomi said. When do we start? They started the next morning. In the weeks that followed, something began to happen that Lydia had not fully anticipated. She had expected the work to feel like relief, and it did. It felt like breathing after a long time of careful, shallow breaths, but she had not expected it to feel like recognition. Like running into yourself in a place you thought you'd lost access to. She worked long days, not because she had to, not because someone expected her to, but because the work pulled at her in a way that she had forgotten work could pull. She had been good at taking care of things for 8 years. She had been competent and organized and invisibly effective at the 1,000 tasks that kept Grant's life running smoothly. But this was different from that. This was the particular feeling of your mind running at full speed in the direction it was built to run, and the feeling was so different from what she had grown accustomed to that it kept catching her off guard. She would be in the middle of a calculation, something intricate and satisfying, and she would look up at the wall of her small apartment office and think, I forgot I was this. She had not forgotten. She had simply stopped reminding herself because reminding herself made the rest of her life harder to inhabit. The apartment was small. The office was a corner of the living room with a desk she had assembled herself from a flat-pack box at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night, following the instructions exactly, and with more satisfaction than she had expected. Julian's initial funding arrived in her business account, and she looked at the number and felt not the relief of financial security. She had her mother's portfolio for that, separate and intact, and entirely her own, but the specific validation of someone saying, I believe this is real. She hired 2 contractors. She filed the incorporation paperwork. She opened the accounts. She was building something. She did not think about Grant constantly. This surprised her too. She had expected him to take up more space to be present in the way that someone who has defined your life tends to be present even after they're gone. But the work occupied the space he had vacated with a thoroughness that was almost efficient. She thought about him when the quiet got heavy at night, and occasionally when something reminded her of the version of herself she had been inside, that marriage, careful, small, perpetually adjusted. But she did not miss him. She missed the idea she had once had of him in the early years, when she had believed that his inability to see her was temporary rather than structural. She had spent years waiting for him to look at her and actually see what was there, and eventually slowly she had stopped waiting, and somewhere in the stopping she had also stopped needing him to. She had not known that until she left, but it was very clear now. Meanwhile, in his office across the city, Grant Halston was receiving a phone call from Daniel Cho. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 4 weeks after Lydia had walked out the door. Grant was at his desk. He had a meeting in 40 minutes and 3 contracts waiting for his signature and a voicemail from Serena Vale. He had not returned because that particular situation had clarified itself with a speed that he found almost embarrassing in retrospect. He had not spoken to Serena since the night Lydia had asked her to leave. The entire arrangement had collapsed the moment it was exposed, which told him something about its foundations he chose not to examine too carefully. "I have the report," Daniel said. No preamble. He was not a preamble kind of person. "Go ahead. I'm going to send you the documents, but I'll walk you through the main findings first." A pause. "She's more than you thought." Grant's hand tightened slightly on the phone. "What does that mean?" "It means start with the education. She graduated top 5 in her program at the University of Washington, Financial Technology and Predictive Risk Systems, published 2 papers before graduation, one of which got cited by 3 different industry journals in the following year. She was awarded 2 significant scholarships, not small ones, the kind that institutions offer when they want to claim you later. Grant was very still. She turned down 3 job offers in the 2 months before she went home to Oregon. "I have the names of the firms. I'll include them in the report. One of them is a name you would recognize immediately." "What name?" Daniel said it. Grant said nothing for a moment. The firm in question was not a small company. It was not a flattering to decline company. It was the kind of offer that people built careers around the memory of accepting. "She turned that down," Grant said. "She turned it down because her mother's illness was diagnosed that same month. She went home. She took a job at a restaurant because the shifts allowed her to take her mother to treatment during the day." A pause. "This is documented. Hospital records, treatment schedules, employment records. She was at that restaurant for 16 months. You met her in month 14. Grant stood up. He walked to the window of his office. He looked at the city. "There's more," Daniel said. "Tell me." "During your marriage, she continued her professional development. Not publicly, no publications under her name after the wedding, no public professional presence. But she maintained correspondence with former professors, researchers in her field, a venture capitalist named Julian Mercer." A pause. "She also continued to develop an independent body of work. I found references to it in correspondence. A platform designed financial risk detection for small businesses and households." Grant turned away from the window. "She was building something. She was building something," Daniel confirmed. "For years. Inside the marriage. Privately." Why privately? The question was out before he had decided to ask it, and the asking of it told him something about how much his thinking had shifted, because 6 weeks ago he would not have understood why the question mattered. Daniel, to his credit, answered it straight. "I don't know the internal reasons, but I can tell you that none of her professional contacts from before the marriage appear in any of your shared social or professional circles. She kept them separate, entirely separate." "She had a whole—" Grant stopped, started again. "She had a professional life, running alongside our marriage, that I knew nothing about." "Yes. For how long?" "Based on the correspondence records I accessed, and I want to be clear that I am only looking at what she made accessible in professional forums, at least 4 years, possibly longer." Grant sat back down in his chair, not because he chose to, because his legs made the decision for him. "The financial component," Daniel said, and his voice had shifted slightly, taking on the careful neutrality of someone delivering information they know is going to land hard. "You asked me to look at everything. I did. She has independent assets, inherited from her mother's estate. The portfolio was small when she received it, but it has been actively managed by her as far as I can determine, not a financial advisor, and it has grown considerably." He paused. "I'm sending you the range in the report. It is not in the same category as your own assets, but it is more than sufficient for her to be operating entirely independently." Grant heard this. He sat with it. She had money, her own money, money that had nothing to do with him, that had existed before him, that had continued to exist and grow during their entire marriage without him ever knowing about it. He had spent 8 years treating her financial dependence as a given. He had used it not cruelly, he had told himself, was still telling himself that it had not been cruelty, but as a kind of organizing assumption. She needed him. That was the story. She had needed him, and he had provided, and that was the shape of what they were, and none of it had been true. "Is there anything else?" he asked. His voice sounded strange to him, flatter than usual. "One more thing," Daniel said, "and this I found this morning, which is why I'm calling now rather than waiting for the report." A pause. "She's founded a company. It's very new. The incorporation is recent, within the last few weeks. The name is Marlowe Systems. The focus is financial risk detection." Grant closed his eyes. "She's already raised a first round," Daniel continued, "led by Julian Mercer. He's a credible investor. If you don't know him, you should. He doesn't lead rounds for projects that aren't serious." "I know who Julian Mercer is," Grant said quietly. "Then you understand what it means that he's attached to this." Grant understood exactly what it meant. It meant that somewhere across the city, in whatever apartment or office Lydia had established for herself in the 5 weeks since she had placed her wedding ring beside his front door, she was already building the future he had never once imagined she was capable of building. And she had not built it in spite of him. She had built it alongside him in the spaces he had never bothered to look into, in the hours he had assumed were empty because he had not checked to see what was in them. He put the phone down after Daniel hung up and sat at his desk for a long time. "I thought about a specific moment from early in their marriage. They had been at a dinner party, one of the social obligations that came with his position, full of the kind of people who discussed money, the way other people discuss weather, and someone had made a remark about algorithmic trading. He could not remember who. He remembered that Lydia had said something quietly, precisely, that had stopped the conversation for a moment. That had made the person who knew the most about algorithmic trading in that room look at her with the specific attention of someone who has just heard something they did not expect. He remembered noticing it. He remembered thinking she's sharp. He remembered that within 10 minutes he had redirected the conversation back toward himself, because that was what he did in rooms, and the moment had passed, and he had never connected the dots between that moment and anything larger. She had known things. She had always known things. She had sat in his world, in his rooms, at his tables, beside him in the car on the way home from those rooms and tables, and she had known things, and he had seen the knowing and filed it under charming and moved on. He had never once asked, where did that come from? He had never followed the thread. He had not followed it because following it might have led somewhere that disrupted the story he was telling himself. The story where she was the waitress he had chosen, and he was the man who had seen something in her and lifted her into a different life. That story required her to be at her core, someone whose life was transformed by his attention. If she had been someone before, if she had been specifically someone whose expertise exceeded his in her particular field, whose professional judgment had been valued by people he himself respected, whose future had been frankly more interesting before she met him than it was during the years she spent as his wife, then the story did not work. So he had not looked. He had simply not looked. He opened the email from Daniel Cho. The attachments loaded one by one: transcripts, a published paper, a professional citation from an industry journal, a scholarship letter, and at the bottom an article from a financial technology news site, small, trade-focused, not the kind of thing that reached mainstream audiences that had run a brief profile on Marlowe Systems and its founder 2 days earlier. He clicked on it. There was a photograph. She was sitting at a desk, a small desk, clearly not a professional photography setup. Nothing. Grant would have chosen for a press photograph, and she was looking at the camera with the particular expression of someone who has stopped performing themselves for other people's comfort. Clear, direct, at rest. The headline said, "Lydia Marlowe is building the financial tool that could change everything for small business." Not Grant Halston's estranged wife. Not the former waitress turned billionaire's spouse. Lydia Marlowe, full stop. He read the article twice, then a third time. Then he put his phone face down on his desk and sat in the silence of his office and experienced something that a man of his particular formation almost never allowed himself to fully experience. He was ashamed, not of the necklace, not of Serena, not of the specific events of that evening in the living room. Those were the symptoms. The shame was for the root of it, the years-long accumulation of never looking, never asking, never following the thread of who she was, because following it was not convenient to the story he needed to believe. He had told her she was nobody before he found her. He had believed that. He had believed it completely because believing it had been comfortable, and because comfort had always been available to Grant Halston in sufficient quantities that he had never been forced to question whether he was paying for it with something he could not afford to spend. He had spent it. He had spent 8 years of a remarkable woman's life, convincing her in 1,000 small and large ways that what she was before him did not matter. And she had let him, because she had loved him, and love had made her willing to be smaller than she was. And now she was not small anymore. She was in fact building something that his own team had been trying to solve for 2 years without success. He did not know that part yet. He would know it soon. But sitting here in this moment reading a photograph of his wife, his estranged, extraordinary, quietly furious wife, the fact of her competence was not what was breaking him. What was breaking him was the simpler thing. He had looked at someone exceptional every day for 8 years, and he had seen only what was convenient to see. He had been the lucky one. He understood that now. He had been the lucky one, and he had not known it, and he had spent his luck like a man who does not know the value of what he is spending. The office was very quiet. Outside Seattle was doing what Seattle does, moving building, pouring coffee, writing code, arguing about traffic and housing and the future. The city that had been running in the background of both of their lives, indifferent to the drama inside the houses it contained. Lydia was somewhere in that city right now, working, building, becoming at full volume and full speed the person she had been the whole time, and Grant Halston was sitting in his office alone reading a news article about her like a stranger. He had done this. The full weight of that landed in his chest and stayed there, and he did not try to move it because for once in his life he understood that moving it too quickly was a kind of dishonesty, and he had already been dishonest long enough. He sat with it. The shame, the loss, the specific terrible clarity of understanding too late that you had been holding something extraordinary in your hands the whole time, treating it like it was ordinary, and now it was gone. He sat with all of it. Outside the window, the city kept moving, indifferent, relentless, exactly as it always had. The divorce papers arrived on a Wednesday morning 6 weeks after Lydia walked out. Grant's attorney placed them on his desk with the particular careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news they have been paid to deliver without editorializing. Grant looked at them for a long moment without touching them. Then he picked them up and read them the way he read contracts completely from the first line to the last, missing nothing. They were clean, precise, written by someone who knew exactly what they wanted and had taken the time to be specific about it. No hostility in the language, no punitive reach, just clarity, the kind of clarity that told him her attorney had been given very clear instructions from a client who knew her own mind. He signed nothing yet. He told his attorney he needed time to review. His attorney said, of course. What Grant actually needed was not time to review the documents. He knew that. The documents were straightforward. What he needed was time to understand how a woman he had believed was financially dependent on him had produced paperwork. This composed and this unhurried, because unhurried was the word that kept coming back to him. There was no desperation in these pages, no reaching for more than was fair, just a woman stating clearly what was hers and asking for it back. That kind of document did not come from someone who was scared. He thought about the portfolio, the number Daniel Cho had put in the report. He had looked at it 3 times since Tuesday afternoon, and each time it had the same effect, a small, specific jolt, like touching something you did not expect to be warm. She had that before him. She had grown it during him. She had never needed the thing he had spent 8 years using as the organizing premise of their entire relationship. He called his attorney back and said, "I need the full financial disclosure process, both sides, everything." His attorney said that was standard. Grant said, "I want to see her numbers when they come in. I want to understand the full picture." His attorney said he would arrange it. 3 weeks later, the disclosure documents landed on his desk in a manila envelope that looked entirely ordinary and contained something that rearranged the furniture of his understanding completely. He read through Lydia's financial disclosures with the focused attention of a man who has built his entire career on reading numbers and knowing what they mean. The portfolio was exactly what Daniel had described, significant, actively managed, diversified, in ways that reflected genuine financial intelligence rather than lucky inheritance. She had not simply received money from her mother and left it sitting. She had managed it, carefully, conservatively, and very well. Then he reached the section on separate premarital assets. He read it twice. He called his attorney. "She had this before our marriage. Yes, it's clearly documented as inherited and premarital. And during the marriage," he stopped, "she never touched my accounts for personal use." A pause. Her personal expenditures came from your household accounts, yes, but her investment portfolio, the inherited assets, remained entirely separate throughout the marriage. She made no claims on your business assets and did not commingle funds. Grant set the phone down on his desk without hanging up and stared at the wall. 8 years. 8 years of him using the word providing like it was a sacrament, like it made him essential, like it explained everything about the shape of their relationship. And the entire time she had been sitting on assets that guaranteed her independence completely. She had not stayed because she needed his money. She had stayed because she loved him. And she had left because that love had run out of reasons to keep choosing him. He picked the phone back up. "Thank you," he said. "I'll be in touch." He sat in his office for 40 minutes without moving. Howe was not a man who cried. He had not cried since his father's funeral 8 years ago, and even then it had been brief and private, and something he had not discussed with anyone. But sitting in his office with Lydia's financial disclosures on his desk, he came closer than he had in a very long time to something that felt like it was waiting just beneath the floor of his composure, pressing upward. He did not let it through, but he felt it. I thought about every time he had said my money, every time he had said I provide for you, every time he had calibrated the balance of their relationship around the assumption that she owed him something for the life he had given her. Every strategy, every guilt, every casual reminder that she had come from very little, all of it had been built on a foundation that turned out to be completely false. She had never owed him anything. She had simply chosen him. And he had taken her choice and turned it into evidence of her need. He stood up. He walked to the window. He looked at the city. And then, because Grant Halston was fundamentally a man of action, even when the action required was internal, he made a decision. I was going to find out everything, not to win something, not to build a case, but because he understood now with the particular conviction that arrives when shame finally settles into something productive, that he owed it to himself to understand who he had actually been married to. Even if what he found made him smaller, even if the full picture was harder than the parts he had already seen. He called Daniel Cho again. "I need you to go deeper on the professional history," he said. "Everything she published, everything she presented, every conference she attended, the platform she's building, the investors, the team. I want to understand the actual scope of what she created." Daniel said he would have something within a week. It took 5 days. The second report was longer than the first, considerably longer. Grant read it on a Saturday morning alone in his house with no meetings scheduled and nowhere to be, which was unusual enough for him that the emptiness of the day felt intentional, like a space he had unconsciously created for exactly this. The report started with the academic record. He already knew the broad outlines from the first report, but Daniel had gone further this time. He had pulled the actual publications, the actual citation records, the actual letters from faculty members that accompanied her scholarship applications. Grant read them one by one. Her thesis advisor had written in a recommendation letter that was a matter of institutional record that Lydia was among the top 3 students he had supervised in 22 years of teaching. He had written that her ability to translate complex systemic risk analysis into applicable frameworks was, and Daniel had italicized this in the report, genuinely unusual. Grant read that sentence 3 times. Genuinely unusual. From a man who had spent 22 years teaching some of the sharpest financial minds in the Pacific Northwest, he kept reading. The firm that had offered her a position, the one Daniel had named in the first report, the one Grant had recognized immediately, had not made a standard junior offer. The report included a summary of what Daniel had been able to piece together from professional correspondence records. They had offered her a senior analyst position, not an entry role, a senior position at 23 years old, which was the kind of offer that got talked about in professional circles because it almost never happened. She had turned it down to go home to her mother. She had turned down that specific offer, that once-in-a-career kind of recognition, and gone home to wait tables so she could take her mother to chemotherapy. Grant set the report down. He breathed. He picked it back up. The section on Marlowe Systems was the longest part of the report because in the 5 days since Daniel had begun compiling it, things had moved quickly. Julian Mercer's involvement had attracted attention. 2 other investors had joined the first round. Naomi Pierce's technical credentials were outlined. She was exceptional. The report made clear the kind of engineer who could have been working anywhere and had chosen to work here, which meant something about the project's credibility in the technical community. And then Daniel had included at the end of the report something Grant had not asked for, but that Daniel had apparently decided was relevant. A note, typed brief, entirely professional. It said, industry contacts I spoke with in the course of this research described Marlowe Systems as one of the most credible new entrants in financial risk technology in the past 2 years. The platform addresses a genuine gap that several larger firms have attempted and failed to fill. Multiple contacts use the word inevitable. Inevitable. Grant closed the report. He sat with the word inevitable. As in this was always going to exist. As in the platform was a matter of when, not if, because the intelligence and the preparation and the years of quiet development had been building toward it, with the kind of momentum that only resolves in one direction. She had been building something inevitable, inside his marriage, in the hours he had never thought to ask about. He stood up and walked to the kitchen and made himself a cup of coffee and stood at the counter and drank it. And for the first time since she had left, he did not try to solve anything. He did not reach for a strategy or a framework or an action item. He just stood there with his coffee and let the full enormity of his own failure arrive without trying to manage it. It took a while. The failure was large. On a Tuesday morning, 3 days later, Grant walked into his weekly board meeting and took his usual seat at the head of the table and listened to his head of strategic development, a man named Carter Webb, present a problem that the technology team had been working on for 18 months without a satisfying solution. The problem was this. Halston Capital had been trying to build a risk detection tool for the community banking partnerships they were pursuing in their expansion strategy. The institutional market was saturated. The growth opportunity was in smaller regional banks and credit unions, but those institutions needed a different kind of risk analysis, simpler, faster, built for the specific financial patterns of small businesses and households rather than large institutional portfolios. Carter's team had been building toward a solution and had consistently hit the same wall. The algorithmic models that worked for institutional data did not translate cleanly to the smaller, messier, more irregular data that community-level banking generated. Carter was explaining this with the particular careful frustration of someone who has been explaining it for a long time to someone who keeps expecting a different answer. Grant listened. He had heard this presentation in various forms 4 times. And then sitting at the head of his own board table, he heard something he had not been able to hear the previous 4 times, because the previous 4 times he had not yet read Daniel Cho's second report. Carter was describing with precision and without knowing it exactly the problem that Marlowe Systems was built to solve. Grant was very still for a moment. Then he said, "What do we know about Marlowe Systems?" Carter looked up. "I'm sorry." Marlowe Systems, it's a fintech startup, recent Seattle-based, risk detection focus. Grant kept his voice level and professional. "Has anyone on the research team looked at them?" Carter exchanged a glance with the analyst beside him. "Not specifically. Should we?" "Yes," Grant said. "I want a full evaluation on my desk by the end of the week. Platform capabilities, technical architecture, market positioning, everything." Carter nodded. "I'll get on it." The meeting continued. Grant participated in the rest of it with his usual precision and said nothing further about Marlowe Systems. But the thing that had settled into his chest when Carter was speaking did not leave. It sat there for the rest of the day, specific and unavoidable. His own company needed what his wife had built. His own company had been failing to build for 18 months the thing she had been quietly developing for 3 years in the margins of their marriage. I was still sitting with that when his phone rang that evening. He looked at the screen. The name that appeared was not one he had expected. It was Lydia. He picked up on the first ring, which was more revealing than he would have liked but could not be helped. Lydia. Her voice was professional, perfectly composed, the voice she used in rooms where she had decided on the terms of engagement in advance. "I'm calling about the divorce proceedings. My attorney has been in contact with yours, but I wanted to address something directly." "Of course," he said. He kept his voice neutral. "I understand there's a delay on the financial disclosure review on your side. I'm not trying to rush the process, but I'd like to understand the timeline." "There's no intentional delay," he said. "I've been reviewing the disclosures." "All right." A pause. "Is there something in my disclosures that's causing a question?" He could have said no. He could have managed the conversation back toward the professional and the practical and let her attorney handle the rest of it. That was what the situation called for. That was the appropriate response. He said, "You had that portfolio before we met." A silence. Brief. one breath long. "Yes," she said. "And you managed it yourself?" "Yes." "During our entire marriage?" "Yes, Grant." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why didn't you tell me?" The question came out differently than he intended, less strategic, more raw. He heard it after he said it, and would have taken it back if taking things back were something he knew how to do. Lydia was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she said, "Because in the first year I wanted to know whether you could love me without knowing about it. I wanted to know whether what you felt was about me or about what I represented." A pause. "And by the time I had my answer to that question, it didn't seem worth raising." The sentence landed in him like something dropped from a height. "By the time I had my answer." "What was your answer?" he asked, and his voice was quieter than he had intended. She did not respond to that. "Is there anything else about the disclosures?" she said. "Lydia, I'd like to keep this to the practical matters for now," she said. "If you have questions about the documents, please have your attorney contact mine." She hung up. He held the phone for a long time after the call ended. "By the time I had my answer." She had tested him. Not maliciously, he understood that sitting there, he understood that the testing had not been a game, but a genuine hope. The hope of a woman in love with a man she was not yet sure deserved her, waiting to see if he would see her without the credentials and the portfolio and the professional history to guide him toward it. He had not seen her. He had seen the waitress. He had decided that was the full picture. He had stopped looking. And she had known. She had known for years that he had stopped looking. She had packed a bag 3 weeks before she needed it, which meant she had been preparing for the end of a marriage she had already understood was over. She had not left impulsively or emotionally. She had left with the methodical clarity of someone who has given a situation every possible opportunity and finally accepted the verdict. He had failed a test he had not known he was taking. The week's end arrived, and Carter Webb's evaluation of Marlowe Systems landed in Grant's inbox at 4:15 on a Friday afternoon. It was 32 pages long. Grant read all of it before he left the office. Carter was not a man who overstated things. He was precise, technical, and allergic to enthusiasm that wasn't justified by data. His report on Marlowe Systems was, by his standards, extraordinarily positive. The platform Carter wrote addresses the community-level risk detection problem with an approach that our team has not encountered in any competing product we have evaluated. The algorithmic architecture is clean and scalable. The founder's background in predictive risk systems is evident throughout the technical design. If the early performance metrics hold, this platform is not an incremental improvement on existing tools. It is categorically different. Then, near the end of the report, Carter had written a recommendation. He recommended that Halston Capital pursue a partnership conversation with Marlowe Systems immediately before competitors became aware of the platform's capabilities and before the company's next funding round made the terms more expensive. He wrote, "I would suggest approaching the founder directly. Based on everything in this evaluation, she is not someone who will respond well to being managed. She will need to be treated as an equal partner from the first conversation." Grant read that sentence, and something in him that had been braced against something released slightly. She will need to be treated as an equal partner from the first conversation. Carter had written that about a business stranger. Grant had not managed it with his own wife across 8 years of marriage. He called Carter the next morning. "I've read the evaluation," he said, "and I'll set up a presentation. Invite Marlowe Systems in for a formal review. Full board, full technical team. Give them the platform to present what they've built." Carter paused. "You want to do this formally? Not an informal conversation first?" "Formally," Grant said. "She deserves a proper room." Another pause. Carter was too professional to ask who she was. "I'll reach out to their contact immediately." "One more thing," Grant said. "When you contact them, when you reach out to arrange the meeting, make sure the invitation comes from my office, with my name on it." Carter understood the implication, even without the explanation. He said he would handle it. He asked no further questions. The invitation reached Lydia's email on a Monday morning. She read it twice. Then she called Julian. "Halston Capital wants a presentation," she said without preamble. Julian was quiet for a moment. "Grant's company." "Yes." It's a legitimate business inquiry," she said. "Carter Webb sent the invitation. He's the head of strategic development. I know his reputation. He doesn't send invitations for things that aren't serious. But you know why this is happening. "I know what the business reason is," she said. "They have a community banking expansion that needs exactly what we built. That's why this is happening." "Lydia, Julian, he's going to be in that room." She was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, "I know. And you still want to take the meeting." "This is a real opportunity for Marlowe Systems," she said. "Our platform needs institutional partnerships to scale. If Halston Capital is the right partner on the merits, then the fact that my estranged husband runs it does not change the evaluation. I'll take the meeting. I'll present what we built, and I'll evaluate whatever they offer based on the same criteria I'd apply to anyone else." Julian exhaled. "You know what that is, right? What you just described." "What?" "That's exactly what he could never do with you," Julian said. "He could never see you outside the story he'd already told himself. You're about to walk into his boardroom and do for him exactly what he never did for you." Lydia said nothing for a moment. "I know," she said finally, "and that's not why I'm doing it. I'm doing it because the company comes first." "I know," Julian said. "That's what makes it extraordinary." She spent the following week preparing with a focus that surprised even Naomi, who had never seen Lydia anything less than fully prepared. They refined the deck. They stress-tested every technical claim. They ran through the financial projections until Naomi could recite them backward. They anticipated every question a sophisticated board would ask and built answers that were accurate and precise and said exactly what needed to be said without a single unnecessary word. On the morning of the presentation, Lydia was in the Marlowe Systems office by 6:30. She drank her coffee. She reviewed the deck one more time. She changed nothing because it was ready. Naomi arrived at 7. She looked at Lydia for a moment. "You good?" "I'm good. Because we're about to walk into your ex-husband's building and tell his board they need us." "Estranged husband," Lydia said. "The divorce isn't final." "Right." Naomi picked up her laptop. "How are you feeling?" Lydia considered the question with genuine honesty, the way she considered most things. "Like myself," she said, "which is the right answer." Naomi smiled. "Let's go." They arrived at Halston Capital's downtown Seattle offices at 9:45 for a 10 o'clock presentation. The building was one Grant had moved into 3 years ago, all glass and clean lines, and the specific kind of architectural confidence that announces wealth without being vulgar about it. Lydia had attended one event here early in the building's occupancy, standing beside Grant, at a reception where she had talked to 3 of his executives about financial modeling and been told by 2 of them afterwards separately that they hadn't expected her to be so well informed. She had smiled and thanked them and said nothing about what she had expected. She and Naomi were shown to the presentation room by a young assistant who was professional and impeccably prepared, and who gave no indication of knowing who Lydia was beyond the name on the meeting invitation. The room was large with a wall of windows on one side and a long conference table set for 14 people. Lydia connected her laptop to the presentation system. She did not look at the door. She set up the slides and checked the display and confirmed the audio and did all the small preparatory things that needed doing, and she did them with her full attention, because that was how she approached things. The board filed in at 10 o'clock. Carter Webb introduced himself first, direct smart, the kind of person who makes you understand within 30 seconds of meeting them that they have done the reading. He shook her hand and said he was glad they had been able to arrange this and that the team was looking forward to the presentation, and she believed him because nothing in his manner suggested performance. The other board members followed, and then last through the door was Grant. She had known he would be there. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything specifically practically without drama. She had thought about it the night before while she was going through the deck one final time, and she had decided that she would treat his presence in the room the same way she would treat anyone else's presence in the room. Noted, relevant to nothing. The presentation was the presentation. He looked tired. That was the first thing she noticed involuntarily. He looked like a man who had not been sleeping well, which was new for him in 8 years of marriage. She had never seen Grant look tired. He looked otherwise exactly as he always looked, immaculate, composed, carrying the room's attention the way he always did, with the ease of someone who has never had to try for it. He met her eyes as he took his seat. She nodded once, professional. He nodded back. Carter said, "Lydia, whenever you're ready." She looked at the room. 14 people, all of them watching her, some of them knowing who she was and some of them not. And it did not matter because what she was about to show them was the same regardless of any other context. "Thank you for having us," she said. "I'm going to start with a problem you already know you have because I understand it better than most people in this industry, and then I'm going to show you exactly how we solved it." The room was immediately completely attentive. She began. She presented for 45 minutes. She had built the deck to run 40 minutes, but the first question came at the 30-minute mark from a board member named Hiroshi Tanaka, who was the sharpest technical mind in the room and who had clearly read Carter's evaluation and pushed immediately toward the deepest part of the architecture. She answered him completely, without referring to her notes, without deflecting, without the slightest suggestion that the question had surprised her. Tanaka asked to follow up. She answered that too. Another board member asked about scalability. Naomi took that one precisely and without hesitation. The board noticed the smoothness of the handoff and the quality of both answers, and the room shifted almost imperceptibly towards something warmer. Grant said nothing for the first 40 minutes. He watched. She was aware of him watching in the way you are aware of something in your peripheral vision, present, registered, not disruptive. She did not look at him directly. She did not avoid looking at him. She simply looked at the room and the deck and the people asking her questions and answered everything they needed answered. At 47 minutes, Carter said, "This is impressive work. I'd like to open the room to broader questions before we discuss next steps." And Grant spoke. His voice was the same voice she had heard across 1,000 dinner tables and in 100 different rooms over 9 years together. She had spent 8 years being arranged and diminished by that voice, and she had also spent 8 years before that falling in love with it, and now it was simply a voice in a room. "I have a question," he said. "Not technical, more foundational." Carter nodded. Grant looked at her, not at the slide behind her, at her. "How long have you been developing this platform?" The room was quiet. Lydia looked back at him. "The core concept is about 4 years old. The full build has been underway for approximately 18 months. 4 years, he repeated. "Yes. And what made you certain the market gap was real, seen?" She recognized the question. It was not a business question. It was a real question wearing a business question's clothes. It was asking, how did you know this was worth believing in? She answered it straight. Because I had spent years watching what happened to small businesses and ordinary households when the warning signs were there, but the tools to read them weren't. I knew the gap was real because I had seen what the absence of the solution cost people. She paused. When you've watched something fail because a tool didn't exist, you don't second-guess whether the tool is necessary. You just build it. Grant held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Then he said quietly, "I understand." And somehow in the room with 14 other people present, it was clear to both of them that he was not talking about the platform. Carter moved the conversation forward. Next steps were discussed. A formal partnership evaluation was proposed. Terms would be explored. Both sides agreed to continue the conversation. When the room began to clear, Carter stayed to finish a conversation with Naomi about technical specifications, and the other board members filtered out, and Lydia was gathering her things from the table when she became aware that Grant was still in the room. She kept gathering her things. He said, "Can I have 5 minutes?" She straightened. She looked at him. Yes. Carter and Naomi moved to the far end of the room, understanding without being told that the conversation at this end was private. Grant stood on the other side of the conference table. He did not try to close the distance between them, which she noticed, and which was new. The Grant of their marriage would have managed the physical space. This version of him stayed on his side of the table and spoke to her across it. "I thought I gave you a life," he said. Not an accusation. Not a defense, just a statement of what he had believed offered plainly the way you offer something you understand now was wrong. Lydia looked at him. "You gave me expensive things, Grant. Those were never the same thing." He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it. He did not flinch away from it or reframe it. He just took it. "I know," he said. I've been trying to understand when I stopped seeing you, whether I ever really started." He paused. "I don't have a good answer to that." "I know you don't," she said. "I read your work," he said. "The papers, the early publications." He stopped. "I didn't know. I want to be clear that I understand how inadequate that is, saying I didn't know when the reason I didn't know is that I never asked." You didn't ask, she agreed. No. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you didn't lose me when I walked out of your house. He looked directly at her. I heard you say that, the night you left. She had said, you didn't lose me when I walked out of your house. You lost me every time I spoke, and you decided I had nothing worth hearing. She had not expected him to remember it verbatim. You lost me every time I spoke, she said, and you decided I had nothing worth hearing. Yes, he said. He did not look away. That's what I did. The apology when it came was not the kind he had given before in their marriage, not the managed, calibrated apology of someone resolving a situation, but something quieter and more effortful. I'm sorry, he said. Not for that night, for the years. She held the apology for a moment. She did not dismiss it. She did not accept it warmly either, because warmth would have been dishonest, and dishonesty was not something she was interested in anymore. I hear you, she said. She picked up her laptop. We'll have our attorneys coordinate on the partnership terms. She walked toward the door. At the threshold she stopped, not because she had decided to, but because something made her stop some awareness of the moment's weight. She did not turn around, but she spoke. You asked how I knew the market gap was real, how I knew it was worth building. She paused. I knew because I had been living inside the gap for years. I knew what it cost. I knew what was missing. She took a breath. Some things you know because you studied them. Some things you know because you lived them. She walked out. Behind her, in the quiet of the emptied conference room, Grant Halston stood alone at the table where he had just watched his estranged wife present one of the most compelling things he had seen in 20 years of business. Naomi passed him on her way out. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Carter stopped beside him. Well, Carter said carefully, she's the real thing. I know, Grant said. Did you know? Carter asked, not unkindly, genuinely. Grant looked at the door Lydia had walked through. No, he said. That's the problem. Carter nodded. He picked up his folder. I'll start on the partnership framework this week. He left. Grant stood alone in the room. The presentation screen still showed the last slide of Lydia's deck, a single-line white text on a dark background. The platform's tagline, the sentence she had apparently chosen to close every pitch with. It said, "Built for the people the big systems forgot." He read it. I thought about a woman standing in an Oregon restaurant in a white apron, exhausted from a morning of chemotherapy waiting rooms and a long shift that had not yet ended, meeting a man who looked at her and saw only what she appeared to be. He thought about 8 years of her knowing things in rooms where he had decided she had nothing to contribute. He thought about a bag packed 3 weeks before it was needed, sitting quietly at the back of a closet shelf. He turned off the presentation screen. He walked out of the room. In the elevator going down, he looked at his own reflection in the polished metal of the doors and saw what he had not been able to see before, not all the way. He had been the lucky one. From the very beginning, in a small Oregon restaurant on a rainy Tuesday afternoon 9 years ago, he had been the lucky one, and he had spent every day since then believing exactly the opposite. The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened. He stepped out into the lobby of his own building and kept walking because there was nothing left in that room to hold him, and because somewhere across the city, a company called Marlowe Systems was already moving at a speed that could not be stopped, carrying inside it all the years of a woman's quiet, extraordinary preparation. And the man who had never seen it was only now finally beginning to understand what he had been looking at all along. The partnership evaluation took 3 weeks. Lydia had expected it to take longer. Institutional processes at companies the size of Halston Capital rarely moved quickly. There were committees and reviews and legal sign-offs, and the particular organizational friction of any large enterprise trying to make a decision that required multiple departments to agree simultaneously. She had built her timeline assuming 6 to 8 weeks minimum, and she had told Julian and Naomi the same thing so that nobody was waiting on something that hadn't arrived yet. It took 3 weeks. Carter Webb ran the process with a speed that told her something about how seriously Halston Capital was taking it, and the seriousness told her something about how well Grant's team understood the platform, and the understanding told her that whatever else was complicated about this situation, the business case was not one of the complicated parts. The business case was clean. The platform solved the problem. The numbers were real. Everything else was noise. She met with Carter twice during those 3 weeks. both times at a neutral location, a conference room in a downtown hotel, chosen by mutual agreement without comment from either side on the reason for the choice. The choice was practical. Everyone understood that. Carter was excellent to work with. He was precise, he was honest about what he didn't know, and he asked questions that were genuinely designed to get answers, rather than to position himself. She found herself respecting him in the specific way you respect someone who takes their work seriously without needing to take themselves seriously along with it. At the end of the second meeting, as they were packing up, he said, "Can I ask you something off the record?" She looked at him. "Depends on the question." "Fair." He paused. "Did you design the community banking angle specifically because you knew it was the gap Halston Capital couldn't fill, or did that happen independently?" She looked at him for a moment. He was asking with professional discretion whether she had built the platform with Grant's company in mind, whether this was strategy or coincidence. "I designed it because the gap was real," she said. "I knew what community-level financial institutions needed because I'd spent years studying the cost of what they didn't have. The fact that it addresses something your team has been working on is a function of the market, not the marriage." Carter nodded. He accepted that without further inquiry, which was the right call. "One more question," he said. "Go ahead. Are you going to be able to work with him professionally if the partnership moves forward?" She met his eyes. "I've been answering questions from his board for 3 weeks and I haven't lost my footing once. What do you think?" Carter almost smiled. "I think we should finalize terms." The term sheet arrived on a Thursday. It was fair. It was, she had to acknowledge, more than fair. The valuation reflected real due diligence, rather than someone trying to lowball a founder who had personal reasons not to walk away. She sent it to Julian that afternoon. Julian called her within 20 minutes of reading it. "This is a good offer," he said, and his voice had the particular quality of someone trying to be neutral about something they are actually impressed by. "I know. Strategically, it positions Marlowe Systems exactly where we wanted to be 18 months from now. Access to the community banking network, the institutional credibility, the distribution infrastructure." He paused. "It accelerates everything by at least a year." "I know, Julian. Are you going to take it?" "I'm going to evaluate it the way I'd evaluate any offer," she said, "on the merits. And the merits say yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to take it." Julian exhaled. "Okay, good, because it's the right call and I didn't want to have to argue you toward it." "I wasn't going to let the personal situation make a bad business decision for me," she said. "That's exactly the kind of thing that would have happened to me inside the marriage. I would have bent my professional judgment around his feelings. I'm not doing that anymore." "No," Julian said quietly, "you're not." She countered on 2 terms, minor adjustments, both of them justified by the data, and both of them accepted by Halston Capital within 48 hours. The speed of the acceptance told her they had room and had left it there, which meant Carter had advised Grant to leave room, which meant Carter understood that she was not negotiating from desperation and that pressuring her would cost more than it was worth. She signed on a Monday morning in her own office with Naomi sitting across the desk watching. Naomi said, "How do you feel?" Lydia set down the pen. "Like we built something real." "We did." Naomi paused. "Are you going to tell me you're also feeling about 800 other things right now?" "Probably," Lydia said. "But the building something real part is on top." Naomi nodded. "Good. That's the right order." What Lydia did not say, because she was not ready to say it out loud, and because Naomi was perceptive enough not to push, was that signing the partnership agreement had produced a feeling she had not expected. Not triumph, not relief exactly, something quieter than either of those, something that felt like the particular piece of a decision made cleanly without bending toward anyone else's comfort or anyone else's need. She had evaluated the offer on its merits. She had negotiated what was fair. She had signed when it was right. She had not once asked herself what Grant would think about it. Not once wondered whether it would hurt him or help him, or whether the terms reflected anything about the shape of their personal history. The business was the business. The marriage was the marriage. She had finally completely separated the two. That separation, that clean, clear boundary between her professional self and the woman who had spent 8 years disappearing into someone else's story, was the thing she had been building toward. She understood now for longer than she had been building the platform. The platform was the product. This was the transformation. 2 days after signing, she received a text from a number she did not recognize. The message said, "This is Serena Vale. I know I have no right to contact you. I understand if you don't respond. But I would like to speak with you if you're willing." Lydia read it twice. She stood in her kitchen for a long moment, her coffee going slightly cold beside her, thinking about the woman she had seen in her living room 8 weeks ago with her anniversary necklace around her neck. She thought about what she had felt that night, not the anger which had been present, but not dominant, but the specific, exhausting recognition that she was the only person in that room who fully understood what was happening. Grant had been performing ease, Serena had been performing intimacy, and Lydia had been standing in the doorway understanding all of it, while both of them looked at her like she was the disruption. She typed back coffee. "Tuesday. Tell me where you want to meet." Serena chose a small cafe in the Capitol Hill neighborhood. She was already seated when Lydia arrived, which told Lydia something about her anxiety level, because you arrive early to things when you are afraid the other person might not show, and you want to be there if they do. She was younger than Lydia had remembered from that night, or perhaps she simply looked younger without the performance of the living room around her. She looked like what she probably was, a smart, ambitious woman in her early 30s who had made a bad decision and understood with full clarity now exactly how bad it had been. She stood when Lydia came in. She said, "Thank you for coming." "Sit down," Lydia said, not unkindly. "You don't have to stand." They sat. They ordered coffee. There was a moment of silence that was uncomfortable enough to be honest. Serena said, "I didn't know about the necklace." "I know," Lydia said. And she did know. She had figured that out at some point in the weeks following. Grant would not have told Serena the necklace's history, because telling her would have required acknowledging that it had a history, and acknowledging that would have complicated the story he was telling. "He told me your marriage was essentially over," Serena said, "that you had grown apart, that you were his word was comfortable. He said it like a problem, like you had become comfortable and the marriage had become something neither of you wanted anymore." Lydia held her coffee cup in both hands. "He believed that," she said. "I think he genuinely believed it. You weren't comfortable." "I was invisible," Lydia said. "Those are different things." She looked at Serena directly. "He needed everyone around him to see the same story he saw. He needed you to believe the marriage was a formality, so that whatever he offered you felt uncomplicated. He needed me to believe I was dependent, so that his providing felt like generosity rather than control." She paused. He wasn't constructing lies exactly. He was constructing a version of reality that made him the most important person in every room. Serena was quiet for a moment. "He's like that at work too," she said. "In meetings, he doesn't take up space the way some executives do aggressively. He does it by making everyone else's contribution feel like it's circling back to something he already knew." Lydia recognized that precisely. "Yes. I should have seen it sooner." Serena's voice tightened with something that was its own particular form of anger. "I should have asked more questions." "Maybe," Lydia said. "But you were also being managed. That's not entirely your fault." Serena looked at her. "You're being very generous." "I'm being accurate," Lydia said. "There's a difference." She put down her cup. "I didn't come here to make you feel better, Serena. I came because I wanted to hear what he told you, not to use it against him. I'm past that. But because I wanted to understand the full shape of it." "And now that you've heard it," Lydia considered, "I think he's a man who needed to be needed so badly that he built relationships around the idea of his own indispensability. And I think when people around him stopped confirming that story, he went looking for someone who would." Serena was quiet. Then, "Is that supposed to make me feel less stupid?" "It's supposed to be true," Lydia said. "What you do with it is your own business." They sat for another 20 minutes. The conversation moved to other things, Serena's work, her own assessment of what had happened, the way she had processed the weeks since that night. Lydia listened without judgment and spoke without performance, and by the end of it, they had reached something that was not friendship, not quite, but was a mutual recognition of two people who had both been arranged around the same man's need to be the center of things, and had both for different reasons, and by different routes, ended up on the outside of it. When they stood to leave, Serena said, "For what it's worth, what I've seen in the press about your company, it's remarkable." "Thank you," Lydia said. "He talked about you sometimes," Serena said. "Not often, But when he did, it was always in a way that was about him. You were evidence of something he'd done, something he'd chosen. She paused. He never talked about what you'd done, what you were capable of, not once. No, Lydia said. He didn't know. She walked out into the afternoon and stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed. Not with grief, with something cleaner than grief. The specific feeling of a story completing itself, of a circle, closing of understanding, arriving at last in a place that had been waiting for it. She pulled out her phone. She had 3 emails from Carter Webb, one from Julian, and one from Naomi about a technical issue that needed a decision by end of day. She opened Naomi's first. She walked back to her office. She had work to do. The divorce was finalized on a gray Tuesday morning in October, 11 weeks after Lydia had walked out of the waterfront house and 4 weeks after the Halston Capital Partnership Agreement had been signed. The proceeding was brief. Both sides had been clear about what they wanted, and neither side had chosen to make it harder than it needed to be. Grant had offered more than was required, significantly more properties, a car, a cash settlement that his attorney had clearly advised him would be seen as generous, and that Lydia's attorney had clearly been instructed to evaluate rather than accept automatically. Lydia took what was legally and fairly hers under Washington's community property framework. She left the rest. She kept her mother's portfolio. She kept Marlowe Systems. She kept the apartment in Eastlake that she had signed a full-year lease on with her own money on her second day of freedom. Grant's attorney and the final documentation exchange included a handwritten note from Grant. 2 sentences. Her attorney gave it to her with the careful neutrality of someone who had decided that whatever it said was between the two of them. She read it in her car afterwards, sitting in the parking garage beneath her attorney's building. It said, "I have no excuse for how long it took me to understand what I had. I hope the work goes the way it deserves to go." She folded it. She put it in her bag. She sat with it for a moment. Then she started the car and went back to the office because there was a product development meeting at 2 o'clock and she had 3 things she wanted to raise that couldn't wait. November arrived, and with it the first real moment of public visibility that Marlowe Systems had experienced beyond the trade press. A journalist named Rachel Kim, who wrote for a national financial technology publication, with a readership that extended well beyond the industry, contacted Lydia through the company's press email. She was writing a piece on women founders who had built in the fintech space after career interruptions. She had found Lydia through the earlier trade press coverage and had done enough additional research to ask intelligent questions in her initial inquiry. Lydia said yes. The interview was conducted over 2 sessions, 3 hours total, in the Marlowe Systems office. Rachel Kim was thorough and specific and asked the kinds of questions that could only be asked by someone who had actually read the research. She asked about the thesis. She asked about the scholarship offers. She asked about the years at the restaurant and what had happened to the career Lydia had been building before she went home to Oregon. Lydia answered everything. She talked about her mother with the particular combination of grief and gratitude that had settled into something livable over the years since the death. She talked about the choice to go home, not with regret, never with regret, because the choice had been correct and she would make it again, and about the years of continuing to develop her thinking in the margins of a life that didn't always have margin for it. She talked about the platform and what it was built to do and who it was built to help. Rachel Kim asked, "There's been some reporting that connects your professional story to your marriage to Grant Halston. I want to give you the opportunity to address that directly if you want to." Lydia was quiet for a moment. "My marriage gave me certain things," she said finally. "Stability, time, a context in which I could continue developing my work without financial pressure." She paused. "It also required me to be smaller than I was, to fit myself into a space that wasn't designed for what I actually had to offer. I don't think my ex-husband intended that, but it happened." Another pause. "I'm not interested in telling a story about a bad marriage. I'm interested in telling a story about what becomes possible when a woman stops apologizing for the size of her own capability." Rachel Kim wrote it down. She did not push further. The article ran on a Thursday morning 3 weeks later with the headline, "Lydia Marlowe Built the Future in the Margins of a Life That Couldn't Contain Her." The piece ran long, 4,000 words, the kind of length that publications only give to stories they believe in. It started with the scholarship she had turned down. It moved through the restaurant years and the thesis and the platform's development. It quoted Julian Mercer describing her as one of the most disciplined builders he had ever worked with. It quoted Carter Webb in his capacity as a Halston Capital executive, now in partnership with Marlowe Systems, saying that the platform addressed something his team had spent 18 months failing to solve, and that working with Lydia had been the clearest example he had encountered of what genuine domain expertise looked like in practice. The article mentioned Grant once briefly in the context of the marriage and its end. It did not editorialize. It stated the fact and moved on. By noon the day it ran, the article had been shared 11,000 times. By evening, Lydia's professional inbox had 300 new messages. Investors, journalists, women who had interrupted careers to care for family members and had read the piece and needed to write to someone about it. Community banks in 7 states. A professor at her alma mater asking if she would consider speaking to his graduate program. Naomi walked into her office at 5:15, looked at the number on the screen and said, "I'm going to need you to hire someone to manage your email." "I know," Lydia said. "Today was a big day." "Yes. How are you?" Lydia looked at the screen and then looked away from it toward the window, toward the city, doing its relentless, indifferent, beautiful thing outside. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said. Naomi sat down across from her. "Your mom would have loved this," she said quietly. Lydia held that for a moment. The grief was there, real and present, but it had long since changed shape from the sharp thing it had been in the years immediately after her mother's death into something more like a permanent companion, something that walked beside her rather than sitting on her chest. "She would have printed the article," Lydia said. "She would have sent it to everyone she knew." "And she would have told you weren't working hard enough," Naomi said. Lydia laughed. It was real and unperformed, and it surprised her the way real laughter sometimes does. She absolutely would have. She went home at 7. She made dinner. She sat at her own table in her own apartment and ate it. And the smallness of the apartment, the specific, modest smallness of a space she had chosen for herself, without consulting anyone, without adjusting her preferences to accommodate anyone else's, felt like exactly the right size. Grant read the article the morning it ran. He had set a news alert for Marlowe Systems 2 weeks after the partnership was signed, which was the kind of thing he told himself was professional diligence, and which he understood in the more honest parts of himself was also something else. He read the coverage the same way he had read Carter's evaluation, completely missing nothing looking at the words, rather than at the story he wanted the words to tell. The headline hit him before the article did. Lydia Marlowe built the future in the margins of a life that couldn't contain her. He sat with the headline for a full minute before clicking through to the piece. He read the 4,000 words slowly. He read Rachel Kim's account of the scholarship offers Lydia had turned down, and the chemotherapy waiting rooms, and the thesis advisor's letter, describing her as one of the finest students in 22 years of teaching. He read Julian Mercer's quote. He read Carter's quote, which told him something about how thoroughly Carter had been converted. Carter did not give quotes lightly, and the specificity of what he had said reflected genuine professional respect. He read the paragraph about the marriage, one paragraph, clear factual brief, the marriage, its end, the decision to build Marlowe Systems. Then the article moved on because the article was not about him. The article was not about him. He was a paragraph in a story about someone else's extraordinary life, and the story was true, and the paragraph was accurate, and he had no defense against either. He closed his laptop and sat in his house, the enormous, quiet, expensive house that had never felt emptier than it did in the weeks after the divorce, and he allowed himself to feel the full, unmanaged weight of what the past months had required him to understand about himself. He had built a business empire on the premise that he could see things other people missed, that his particular gift was pattern recognition, the ability to look at a complex situation and identify the signal inside the noise. He had told himself this story so many times in so many boardrooms, in so many moments of strategic decision-making, that it had become the organizing myth of his entire identity. He had missed Lydia completely, not partially, not around the edges. He had looked at one of the most genuinely remarkable people he had ever encountered every day for 9 years, and he had seen a waitress from a small town who was lucky he had found her. He had been sitting next to the signal the whole time and calling it noise. He picked up the phone. He called a therapist named Dr. Samuel Park, whose name had been given to him by his attorney 6 weeks ago as someone who worked with executives dealing with significant personal transitions. Grant had taken the number and put it in his phone and not called it, because calling it felt like an admission he was not ready to make. He was ready now. Dr. Park's receptionist said there had been a cancellation, and he could come in Thursday at 2 o'clock. Grant said he would be there. I was there and on time, which was not something he had ever needed to remind himself to be before. Dr. Park was a small, quiet man in his early 60s who had the particular quality of sitting still in a way that made the room feel still around him. He asked Grant at the beginning of the first session what had brought him in. Grant told him the short version: the marriage, the separation, the article he had read that morning. Dr. Park listened without interrupting. When Grant finished, he said, "What did you feel when you read the article?" "Ashamed," Grant said. He said it without the pause he would have expected himself to need. "And something else. I'm not entirely sure what to call it." "Describe it," Dr. Park said. "Don't name it yet. Just describe what it feels like." Grant thought about it seriously, which was new for him. He was not a man who spent significant time examining the texture of his own emotional states. He had opinions and reactions, and he acted on them, and the space between feeling something and deciding what to do about it had always been very small. "It feels like looking at a photograph taken years ago," he said slowly, "and realizing you're not in it, that you were in the room the whole time, but somehow you're absent from the record of it." He paused. "Like I was there for everything and I missed all of it." Dr. Park nodded slowly. "That's grief," he said. "Not just for the marriage, for the version of yourself who was present without being present." Grant sat with that. "Can I ask you something?" Dr. Park said. "That's why I'm here. When you tell me about your marriage the way you've described it in the last 30 minutes, you talk a great deal about what you provided, what you gave, what you offered." He paused. "You haven't said anything about what she gave you, what she brought into your life that wasn't there before." Grant opened his mouth. He thought about the fireplace being on when he came home. He thought about his dry cleaning sorted exactly right. He thought about the way his social calendar had always been managed, so that the things he actually wanted to attend were the things that appeared on it, and the things he would have resented were handled without reaching him. And then he thought about something else. I thought about a night 3 years into their marriage when he had come home from a presentation that had not gone well, not failed, but not what he had wanted, and he had been in a particular kind of silent fury that he usually managed by working late rather than bringing it home. He had come home early by accident because he couldn't concentrate, and Lydia had been sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop, and she had looked up and immediately understood without a word exchanged that something was wrong. She had not asked. She had closed her laptop and made tea he hadn't asked for and sat with him for an hour while he talked gradually about what had happened. Not fixing it, not offering solutions, just listening in the way she listened completely, with the particular quality of attention that made you feel that what you were saying was the most important thing being said anywhere at that moment. He had not thought about that night in years. He had not thought about what it had meant that she could do that she had always done that walking into a room she was in had felt for years like something easing in his chest, and he had attributed it to the comfort of home rather than to the specific, irreplaceable quality of who she was. "She made me feel like I was worth listening to," he said, "like what I thought and felt was worth someone's full attention." He stopped. "And I never once made her feel the same way." Dr. Park said nothing. "I took what she gave and I built an empire out of it," Grant said, "and then I told myself I was the one who had given her something to be grateful for." The room was very quiet. "That's the beginning," Dr. Park said, "knowing that." "It doesn't feel like a beginning," Grant said. "It feels like a very late arrival at something I should have understood years ago." "Late arrivals are still arrivals," Dr. Park said. "The question is what you do once you're there." Grant went home from that session and sat in the kitchen of the house that was too large and too quiet and thought about the question for a long time. I thought about it the next day and the day after and the week that followed. He carried it with him into his board meetings where he began deliberately with a self-consciousness that gradually became something more natural to ask questions before he offered answers. To stay with someone else's thinking long enough to find out where it was going before he replaced it with his own. Carter Webb noticed it within 2 weeks. He said nothing because Carter was not the kind of person who made a production of noticing things. But there was a shift in the board meetings, a slight and specific difference in the air when Grant spoke, and people around the table began responding differently. Not more deferentially, less deferentially actually, because a room in which the most powerful person is genuinely listening is a room where other people feel safe to say things they actually mean. Grant noticed the difference. He kept going. He restructured two internal processes that had been bottlenecks for years, both of them structural issues he had been aware of but had not addressed, because addressing them would require acknowledging that the way he had built them initially had been wrong. He addressed them. He told his team directly that the processes had been built incorrectly and that they were fixing them, and the directness of it. The absence of defensive framing produced a response from his team that he had not expected and that moved him more than he would have predicted. People started talking to him differently. Not better exactly, more honestly, in the way people talk when they believe the person listening is actually listening, rather than waiting for the right moment to redirect toward what they already think. He called Patricia one evening 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. "I've been going to therapy," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "How is it?" "Hard," he said. "Accurate." "Those are usually the same thing," she said. "I've been thinking about something you asked me," he said. "When I called you after Lydia left, you asked if I'd ever asked her what she did before she worked at the restaurant." "I remember." "I hadn't," he said. "I never asked, and I've been trying to understand why." He paused. "I think I didn't ask because I was afraid the answer would complicate something I needed to stay simple. The story about who rescued whom." Patricia was quiet. "I needed to be the rescuer," he said. "I think I've needed that my whole life. With Lydia, it found a particularly clean shape. She appeared to need rescuing. I provided it. And I held on to that story so tightly that I never noticed it was strangling everything else." "Grant," Patricia said. "I know. I've watched you do this your whole life," she said. "Turned the people who loved you into evidence of your own importance. Dad did it too. I think you learned it from him." He took a breath. "I know. The difference," she said carefully, "is that you're 53 and you're naming it, which is about 30 years later than would have been ideal, but earlier than never." He exhaled. "That's either generous or devastating." "I meant it as both," she said. He went to his next therapy session. He kept going. Winter came to Seattle with its particular quiet insistence, and Marlowe Systems grew. The Halston Capital Partnership opened the community banking network that Lydia had identified as the platform's primary entry point, and the entries multiplied quickly. 12 banks in the first month, 31 by the end of the second, a regional credit union association in the third month that brought 80 member institutions in a single partnership agreement. The numbers were moving faster than Julian's projections. Lydia hired 6 people in November, 4 more in December. She moved the office to a larger space in the South Lake Union neighborhood, which felt significant in a way she did not examine too carefully because she was too busy to examine much of anything beyond the next deliverable. She talked to her mother in the way she had developed over the years since the death. Not prayer exactly, not the formal version, but a kind of internal address, a way of sharing things with someone who was no longer present to share them with directly. She said, "I'm building it, Mom. It's working." She thought about what her mother would have said back. Probably something practical, probably something about not letting the momentum make her careless. Her mother had been a woman of extraordinary discipline who had distrusted comfort, not because she was harsh, but because she had understood from long experience that the moments when things were going well were precisely the moments when you most needed to stay attentive. She stayed attentive. On a Friday afternoon in mid-December, 3.5 months after the divorce was finalized, and 5 months after the night she had walked out of Grant's house with a canvas bag and the rest of her life waiting somewhere ahead of her, Lydia received a phone call from a number she recognized. She looked at it for one ring. She answered, "Grant." "Lydia." His voice was different. Not performing ease, not managing the room. Just his actual voice, the voice underneath the performance, the one she had heard occasionally in the early years, and increasingly rarely as the years went on. "I wanted to call. I don't need anything from you. I wanted to say something." She sat back in her chair. "Okay." "I've been going to therapy," he said. She said nothing. "I'm not telling you that so you'll think better of me," he said. And the specificity of that, the preemptive acknowledgement of the possible wrong interpretation, told her that whatever he was doing was real. "I'm telling you because I've been spending a lot of time understanding what I did. Not the necklace, not that night, the years. And she said, "And I've been sitting with it," he said. "There's not a version of this where I turn it into something I can manage or fix. It's not that kind of thing." He paused. "I just wanted you to know that I understand it now. What I did. What it cost." Lydia was quiet for a long moment. "I hear you," she said. "That's all I needed," he said. "I'm not asking for anything. There's nothing to ask for." "There isn't," she agreed. Another pause. Then, and his voice changed slightly, became something almost careful. "Is there any version of this where we start again?" The question hung in the space between them. She had known it was coming, not because she had been waiting for it, but because she understood him well enough to know that even a changed man would eventually ask it, because wanting was not something that changed as quickly as understanding. She held it for a moment. She gave it the respect of an honest answer. "There may be a version where I forgive you," she said. "I'm not there yet, but I can see it from here. That doesn't mean there has to be a version where I return to you." She paused. "I'm not the woman who left your house anymore. And the woman I am now, she wasn't built to fit inside someone else's story. She was built to tell her own." Grant said nothing for a moment. Then, "I know." 2 words. But she heard in them something that had not been there across 8 years of marriage, the complete, undefended acknowledgement of someone who has finally stopped needing the last word. "Take care of yourself, Grant," she said. "You too," he said. She hung up. She sat at her desk for a moment. Outside the window, Seattle was doing what it always did, moving, building, arguing with the weather, becoming, and never quite finishing. The city did not know or care what had just ended or what had just begun. It simply continued. She turned back to her screen. She had a product meeting in 20 minutes and a decision about the East Coast expansion that couldn't wait past Monday, and an email from a community bank in Ohio that needed a response before end of day. She opened the email. She got back to work. The new year arrived the way New Year's do not with transformation, but with the quiet insistence of time continuing its work regardless of whether you are ready for it. Lydia was ready. January brought 3 things simultaneously: a term sheet from a New York investment group that would constitute Marlowe Systems' second funding round, a speaking invitation from a financial technology conference in San Francisco, and a call from a journalist at a national business publication who had read Rachel Kim's piece and wanted to do a follow-up profile. Lydia handled all 3 in the same week with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything. Now, not because she was immune to the weight of what was happening, but because she had learned across the months since leaving that the work was the answer to most questions she might otherwise have spent time asking. She took the term sheet to Julian on a Thursday morning. He read it at the table across from her, which was how he always read things. She brought him in her presence without the pretense that he needed to study it privately first. He turned pages. He made 3 small marks with a pen in the margins, which was his tell for the parts that needed discussion. He closed the folder. "It's a good round," he said. "I know. The valuation is higher than our 18-month projection." "I know, Julian. By 30%. I can read numbers," she said, and there was warmth in it, the ease of 2 people who had been through enough together that precision no longer required ceremony. "Tell me what the 3 marks are," he told her. 2 of the marks were standard negotiating points terms that were slightly aggressive in the investor's favor and that she could push back on without risking the relationship. The 3rd was more interesting, a board seat provision that would give the New York group a voice in strategic decisions that Julian thought was premature for this stage of the company. "They want influence before they've earned it," Julian said. "Yes," Lydia said. "We're going to counter on the board provision. Observer rights until the C-round full seat contingent on performance milestones." Julian nodded. "That's the right call." "I know." She paused. "Am I being too aggressive?" He looked at her. "No, you're being accurate. There's a difference." He said it with a slight smile because they both recognized the words as hers used back to her. She countered. "The New York group accepted within 48 hours. The round closed in 3 weeks." The number when it landed in the company accounts was the kind of number that changes the texture of a situation. Not because money is the point Lydia had understood for years, in the way that people who grow up with very little and then spend time beside people with very much tend to understand that money is a tool and a terrible master, but because capital at this level meant that the platform could move at the speed the problem deserved. The community banks in 16 states that were now using Marlowe Systems risk detection tools were processing data that was already changing outcomes for the families and small businesses they served. Real outcomes, measurable ones. A bakery in Columbus that had caught a dangerous debt accumulation pattern 6 months before it would have become a crisis. A family in Sacramento that had been flagged for a predatory loan structure before they signed. A small construction company in Nashville whose cash flow irregularities had been identified and addressed before they became insolvency. These were the numbers that Lydia actually cared about. She had Naomi build a dashboard that tracked them, not the financial metrics which Carter Webb's team handled for the partnership reporting, but the human metrics. Families flagged, businesses stabilized, crises prevented. She looked at it every morning before she looked at anything else. Naomi had watched her look at it one morning in February and said, "You built it for her, didn't you?" Not a question, a recognition. Lydia had looked at the dashboard for a moment. She spent her whole life working hard and trusting the system to be fair, and it wasn't designed for people like her. She paused. I built it because the tool she needed didn't exist, because by the time it would have existed through the normal channels, it would have been too late for people like her. Naomi had nodded. She hadn't pushed further. The San Francisco conference was in February, and Lydia flew down on a Tuesday morning with a carry-on bag she packed herself the night before and a speech she had written in longhand first and then typed, because that was how she always wrote things that mattered by hand first, to hear the rhythm of it before she decided on the words. The conference was large. 300 people in a downtown hotel ballroom, the specific mixture of founders and investors and journalists and academics that gathered in these rooms to argue about the future of money and financial systems and what technology could and couldn't solve. Lydia had been to conferences like this as Grant's wife, standing beside him while he worked the room with the practiced ease of a man who understood that his presence was itself a form of currency. She had never been to one as the person the room was waiting to hear. She stood backstage before her slot alone for a few minutes and did what her mother had always told her to do before anything important. She was still. She breathed. She thought about what she was actually trying to say and let everything else fall away. Then she walked out. The reception was immediate and specific, not the polite attention of an audience waiting to be impressed, but something more active, the particular alertness of people who have read her work and come to this room to see if the person matches the ideas. She could feel it. She had been in enough rooms to read that quality of attention, and she let it settle, and then she began. She spoke for 40 minutes. She talked about the platform, about the community banking partnerships, about the real-world outcomes the dashboard tracked. She talked about the gap in financial technology, the way sophisticated risk tools had been built for institutions that were already well-resourced and largely ignored the communities that were most vulnerable to the exact patterns those tools were designed to detect. And then she talked about something she had not planned to talk about. She talked about her mother. She said, "I want to tell you about a woman who worked her entire adult life with the kind of discipline and consistency that should have guaranteed her security. Who saved carefully, who made reasonable decisions, who trusted the systems that were supposed to protect people like her." She paused. "And who still in the last years of her life was navigating financial risk without any of the tools that would have made that navigation easier, because those tools were not designed for her. They were designed for people with more." The room was very quiet. "I built this platform because my mother deserved better tools," she said. "And so does every person in a community bank in a town that most financial technology companies have never heard of. And so does every family making reasonable decisions with limited information and no system designed to help them see what's coming before it arrives." She paused. "That's who we built it for," she said. "Not for the institutions that were already winning, for the people the big systems forgot." The applause when she finished was the kind that builds from the middle of a room rather than starting at the front and spreading, which was the kind that meant something. She took questions for 15 minutes. The questions were good, specific, technical, real. She answered all of them. Afterward, in the reception that followed the session, she was surrounded for the better part of an hour by a continuous rotation of people who wanted to talk. Founders who had heard of Marlowe Systems and wanted to understand the technical architecture. Investors who had missed the second round and wanted to be in the conversation for the next one. Community bankers from small institutions in states she hadn't reached yet. a woman her own age who had interrupted a career in law to care for a sick parent, and who had found her way back through a path that was different from Lydia's, but recognizable in its shape, and who shook Lydia's hand with both of hers and said, "I needed to see this was possible." Lydia held that for a moment. "It is," she said. "It took longer than I expected, but it is." She flew back to Seattle that evening. She had a full day of meetings tomorrow. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. March arrived, and with it, the Miriam Initiative. She had been building it in parallel with everything else for 4 months quietly, with the same careful preparation she brought to every significant decision. The initiative was a scholarship and professional re-entry program for women who had interrupted careers to serve as primary caregivers for parents, for children, for spouses, for anyone who had needed them in the way her mother had needed her. The program would provide direct financial support mentorship, and this was the part she had spent the most time on, a structured pathway back into professional life that acknowledged the gap without treating it as a deficit. She had spent years having her own gap treated as the defining fact of her professional story, the thing that explained everything else about her. She understood precisely what that cost. The initiative would not fix the structural problem. One program never fixes a structural problem. But it would be, as she told the small team she had assembled, to build it a proof of concept. Evidence that women who had left for the right reasons could return and contribute at the level they had always been capable of. Evidence that the gap was not a failure. Evidence that the work they had done while they were gone, the care work, the invisible work, the work that had no salary or job title or performance review, had its own value that did not need to be apologized for before the professional resume was allowed to speak. She named it for her mother. The announcement went out on a Wednesday morning. By evening, 230 women had submitted inquiries. By the end of the week, the number was over 1,000. Naomi came into her office on Friday afternoon and said, "We're going to need a bigger team for the initiative." "I know," Lydia said. "I want to lead the technical side of the vetting process," Naomi said. "Build the application system, the matching algorithm for the mentorship pairs. I've been thinking about how to approach it." "Show me what you're thinking," Lydia said. Naomi showed her. It was good. It was in several respects better than what Lydia had been planning, because Naomi had approached it from a different angle, not from the administrative side, but from the human side, starting with what the applicants needed to feel safe enough to be honest about their situations, and working backward toward the system design. "This is better than my version," Lydia said. "I know," Naomi said, and then caught herself. "No," Lydia said. "Own it. It's better. We're using yours." Naomi smiled. "Okay. This is what building something right looks like," Lydia said. "You bring what you have, and I bring what I have, and we end up with something neither of us would have made alone." She paused. "Nobody gets diminished in this room for knowing something the other person doesn't." Naomi looked at her for a moment. "That's a specific thing to say." "It's a specific thing I needed to say," Lydia said. "Hire whoever you need for the initiative team." Naomi left. Lydia turned back to her screen. She had 312 unread emails, a board update due to Halston Capital's partnership team by Friday, and a decision to make about whether to open a New York office before the end of the year or wait until the third quarter of the following year, when the East Coast community banking partnerships had more data behind them. She had been leaning toward waiting. Julian had been leaning toward moving faster. They had scheduled a call for Monday to work it out. She liked that she had people worth arguing with. In April, a profile ran in a major national business magazine. Not trade press this time, a publication that reached general audiences, the kind of magazine that sat in dentists' waiting rooms and airport newsstands and the break rooms of offices where finance was not the primary business. The piece was headlined, "The Founder Who Built a Billion-Dollar Company in the Space Between Her Other Life." The billion-dollar figure was a projection, not an actuality. She had noted that when they sent her the draft for fact-checking and had asked them to clarify it in the text, they had clarified it. The projection was based on the current growth trajectory and was, as far as she could assess, reasonably grounded. She did not particularly care about the number, except as evidence that the platform was working. What the article got right, and what she had not expected it to get right, was the human story. The journalist had spent 3 hours with Julian, 2 with Naomi, 1 with Carter Webb, and 4 with Lydia herself, and she had assembled them into something that felt more accurate than most profile pieces managed to feel. It got the mother right. It got the scholarship right. It got the years at the restaurant, not as a story of hardship survived, but as a story of a choice made deliberately by a woman who understood exactly what she was trading and made the trade willingly. It mentioned Grant, more than Rachel Kim's article had. 2 paragraphs this time, both of them fair in the specific way that actual fairness, rather than performed fairness, tends to look at acknowledged. The marriage, its end, the personal complexity of the Halston Capital Partnership, and then it quoted Lydia directly on the subject. The quote was from the 4th hour of the interview, when she and the journalist had been sitting in her office, and the formal question and answer structure had loosened into something more like conversation. The journalist had asked carefully whether Lydia thought her marriage had delayed the trajectory that was now playing out. Lydia had thought about that for a moment. She had said, "I think the years inside that marriage cost me time. I think I was smaller than I needed to be for longer than I should have been. And I think the cost of that is real, and I don't want to minimize it by turning it into a lesson that made everything worth it." She had paused. "But I also think that I made choices. I chose to stay. I chose to love someone who didn't fully see me. And I don't want to give the marriage either too much credit for who I am or too much blame for who I wasn't yet. I built myself. The marriage was the context, not the cause." The journalist had published it verbatim. Lydia had read it when the article ran and recognized herself in it, which was the best you could hope for from anything that tried to describe you to strangers. Grant read the article on the morning it appeared. He read it at his kitchen table, which was where he read most things now, not at his desk, not on his phone during a meeting. He had made a practice of reading in the morning with his coffee unhurried, the way he had not made time for anything unhurried in the years when busyness had felt like a virtue. He read the 2 paragraphs about the marriage. He read her quote 3 times. "I built myself. The marriage was the context, not the cause." He put the magazine down. He called Patricia. She answered on the 3rd ring. "I saw the article," she said before he could say anything. "I know," he said. "How are you?" "I'm okay," he said. And it was true, which still surprised him sometimes. Not happy in a simple way, the months of therapy had complicated his relationship with simple happiness, had made him more honest about what he was actually feeling, rather than what he had decided to feel. But okay, in a way that felt real, rather than performed. "I'm actually okay." "Good," Patricia said. "She looks good, Grant." "She looks like herself," he said. "Maybe for the first time since I knew her." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "That says something." "I know what it says." "Are you?" "No," he said. "I'm not reaching out. I said what I needed to say in December. Anything beyond that is for me, not for her, and she doesn't owe me that." "When did you get wise?" Patricia said. "Dr. Park charges $400 an hour," he said. "It adds up eventually." She laughed. He heard it and felt something warm in his chest that had nothing to do with strategy or positioning or how it landed. Just warmth, just his sister's laugh. "I'm proud of you," she said. I know you don't need it from me, but I am." "I need it a little," he said. The San Francisco Technology Conference, where they would finally encounter each other again, was in June, 18 months after the night Lydia had walked out of the waterfront house. It was a larger conference than the February event, one of the marquee annual gatherings in financial technology, attended by the kind of people who shaped the industry's direction, rather than simply participated in it. Lydia had been invited to join a panel on the future of community-level financial infrastructure. Grant had been on the agenda since the previous year as a keynote speaker. She knew he would be there. She had known for 6 weeks since the conference program was published. She attended without adjusting a single thing about her presence. She gave a panel that was, by the responses she received afterward, the strongest of the 5 participants. She had coffee with a potential East Coast partner she had been cultivating for 3 months. She had lunch with Julian, who had flown down from Seattle, and they spent 2 hours going through the 3rd quarter numbers and the decision about the New York office, which they finally resolved in her favor. Wait until the data was stronger, move precisely rather than quickly. Julian raised his water glass. "To being right about the timing," he said. "To the data being right about the timing," she said. "I just read it." In the afternoon session, she sat in the back of the ballroom and heard 2 panels and part of a keynote before slipping out early to return 3 urgent emails from her team in Seattle. She was standing in the corridor outside the ballroom typing on her phone when she heard him. "Lydia." She looked up. Grant was standing 10 feet away, which told her the encounter was not accidental. You did not appear 10 feet from someone in a corridor without having moved toward them deliberately. He looked different from the man she had last seen across a conference table in October. Not better or worse. Different. The specific difference of someone who has been working on themselves in the way that actually costs something, which is not the same as self-improvement performed for an audience. He looked less protected. That was the right word. The particular armor that money and authority and the lifelong habit of controlling rooms tends to build around a person. She could see it was thinner now. Not gone. You do not undo a lifetime of formation in 18 months, but thinner. "Grant," she said. "I saw your panel this morning," he said. "I came in late. I caught the last 20 minutes. And it was the best thing I heard today," he said simply. "No performance in it. Just a true statement." "Thank you," she said. He stood there for a moment, and she recognized the quality of his stillness. He was not trying to manage the conversation. He was simply in it, which was different and new, and she was honest enough to acknowledge the version of him she had wanted to see for years when she was inside the marriage. "I read the magazine piece," he said. She nodded. "The quote at the end," he said, "about the marriage being the context and not the cause." "Yes. I wanted you to know that I think that's—" He stopped, started again. "I wanted you to know that I think you're being generous in how you're framing it." He met her eyes. "You didn't have to do that." "I'm not doing it for you," she said. "I'm doing it because it's accurate. I made my choices. I'm not interested in spending the rest of my life explaining my success through the lens of a bad marriage. It's not large enough to be the explanation." "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." A pause between them, not uncomfortable, just honest. "Your company is extraordinary," he said. "The Miriam Initiative." He paused. "I read about it when it launched. I read about the 1,000 inquiries in the first week." He looked at her. She would be so proud. Lydia held that for a moment. It landed in a way she had not expected. Not because it was wrong, it was in fact exactly right, but because he had known her mother. Not well, not the way Lydia had known her, but he had met her twice in the years before the death had sat at dinner with her, had watched the way Lydia and her mother spoke to each other. He was one of the only people in her current world who had known Miriam Marlowe personally, and his saying so, with such directness without making it about himself, meant something she was not going to pretend it didn't. "Yes," she said. "She would." He nodded. Around them, the conference corridor was full, people moving between sessions, conversations overlapping the specific noise of a gathering of people who were there to do something rather than simply to attend. Neither of them moved toward the noise or away from each other. He said, "I've been different. I know you have no reason to believe that." "I'm not keeping score," she said. "Carter has noticed it. He told me, which was, Carter doesn't tell people things they don't need to hear. He said the board meetings are different." He paused. "I've been trying to actually listen. Before I decide, I already know the answer." "That's a good thing to practice," she said. "I'm a slow learner," he said, "on the things that matter." "Most people are," she said. "The things that matter aren't the ones you can learn in a conference room." He almost smiled. "No, they're not." She looked at him for a moment, really looked the way she had not allowed herself to look in October when the conference table had been between them and the professional context had given her a useful structure to organize herself around. He was 53 years old, tired in some ways, more awake in others. He had done real work on himself, and it showed in the small, specific ways that real work always shows, not in dramatic transformation, but in the accumulated evidence of someone choosing differently again and again in moments that required it. She was glad. She was genuinely glad he was doing the work. She was not going back. These two things were both true at the same time, and the holding of them simultaneously was not painful the way it would have been 6 months ago. It was simply clear. The way most true things are clear once you've stopped working so hard to see something else. "You changed everything," he said. He said it the way he had been unable to say most things across 8 years of marriage without organizing it toward a conclusion, without it being designed to produce a response. Just said it plainly as the fact it was. She looked at him. "No," she said. "I finally stopped changing myself for you." I took that in. She watched him take it in, not flinch from it, not reframe it, just take it with the full weight it carried. The weight of 8 years and a canvas bag and a ring on a table and a seat on a plane to San Francisco and a panel that morning and a company that was serving 300 community banks in 22 states and a scholarship program bearing her mother's name and an office full of people she had hired and a self she had recovered and a life she had built that fit her exactly. "I know," he said. "I know that now." She put her phone in her bag, she looked at him once more, and what she felt was not love, not the way she had once felt it for him, but something adjacent and real, the recognition of someone who had mattered to her, who had cost her something, who had also, in the years of trying to hold their marriage together, revealed to her the exact shape of what she required from her own life. You learned what you needed by understanding what you had been given that was not enough. She was not grateful to him for that, but she was clear. "Take care of yourself, Grant," she said. "You too," he said. She turned and walked toward the conference hall where her next session was beginning, and where Julian was waiting, and where the people who had come to see the founder of Marlowe Systems were already filing in. She did not look back. Behind her, Grant Halston stood in the corridor of a hotel in San Francisco and watched the woman he had married walk away from him for the second time, and this time he did not wait for her to return. This time, he understood that she wasn't going to, and that she shouldn't, and that the not returning was not a failure of his charm or his wealth or his eventual understanding, but the completely appropriate consequence of 8 years of not seeing someone who had been entirely visible all along. He watched her until the door of the conference hall closed behind her. Then he turned and walked in the other direction toward his own session, carrying something he had not carried before, not guilt, which he had processed as far as it was useful, and not hope for something that was not available, but the specific clarifying weight of a lesson fully learned. The woman he had believed he rescued had been building her escape the entire time, not from malice, not from deception, but from the fundamental human requirement of becoming fully oneself. He had not been an obstacle she overcame. He had been a context she outgrew. His greatest mistake had never been underestimating her accomplishments. It had been mistaking her love for him as evidence of her need for him. And her greatest act of courage had not been walking out the door. It had been everything she walked toward. 18 months after a night she had placed a wedding ring on a table beside her husband's front door, Lydia Marlowe was standing in her own story at full height without apology, building something that mattered for people who needed it, naming it after the woman who had taught her that knowledge and character, and the person you build inside yourself are the only things that cannot be easily taken away. She had not won by defeating him. She had won by becoming so completely herself that there was no longer any contest, and that the choosing of herself, the full and fearless and finally free choosing, was the only victory that had ever actually mattered.